Hello everyone. I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. Asterisk Veil of Shadows. Chapter 1. The meeting at midnight. The gallery was a labyrinth of light and shadow, its high ceilings adorned with dangling chandeliers that cast a soft, golden glow over the room. The walls were lined with Elena's paintings, vivid, haunting works that seemed to breathe with life. Amid the hum of cultured voices and the clink of wine glasses, Elena Reyes stood in the center of it all, a vision of ethereal beauty. Her raven hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her emerald-green eyes seemed to capture and reflect the dim light. She was the star of the night, her latest collection drawing gasps and whispers from the crowd. Yet, despite the praise, an unease gnawed at her, a feeling that something in the room was watching her. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the pressure of the evening. But as her eyes wandered, they landed on a painting she hadn't hung herself. It was tucked in a far corner, almost hidden, yet it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The canvas depicted a dark forest, its trees twisted and gnarled, their roots coiling like serpents. In the center stood a figure, cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. Elena frowned, stepping closer. She didn't remember this piece, didn't recognize the brushstrokes. Yet, the longer she stared, the more familiar it felt, as if she'd seen it in a dream. "Striking, isn't it?" a voice said, smooth and low, like velvet over steel. Startled, Elena turned to see a man standing beside her. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to hold the depth of a midnight sky. His presence was magnetic, almost overwhelming, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. He extended a hand, his lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Lucas Blackwood," he introduced himself. Elena took his hand, her fingers brushing against his. His touch was warm, but something about it sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't tell if it was the coldness in his gaze or the way his voice seemed to echo in her mind. "Elena Reyes," she replied, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside her. Lucas's eyes flicked toward the eerie painting, his expression unreadable. "Your work is extraordinary," he said, "but this isn't yours, is it?" Elena shook her head, her gaze drifting back to the canvas. "No. I've never seen it before. I don't even know how it got here." Lucas stepped closer to the painting, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. He tilted his head, as if studying it from a new angle. "It feels alive," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "As if it's watching us." His words sent a chill through Elena, and she quickly averted her eyes, refusing to let the unsettling feeling take hold. The two stood in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Elena couldn't explain it, but there was something about Lucas that drew her in, even as her instincts warned her to keep her distance. He turned to her, his gaze piercing. "Do you believe in fate, Elena?" he asked, his tone casual but weighted with meaning. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. Before she could respond, he continued, "Some things are meant to happen. Some people are meant to meet." As the night wore on, Lucas stayed close, his presence both comforting and unsettling. They spoke of art, of life, of the strange coincidences that seemed to bring them together. He was a novelist, he told her, drawn to the macabre and the unknown. "I write about the things people fear to face," he said, his voice tinged with a dark amusement. Elena listened, captivated by his words yet wary of the shadows that seemed to follow him. By the time the gallery emptied, they were the only ones left, standing in the dim light, the painting still watching from its corner. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Elena glanced at her watch, realizing how late it had gotten. "I should go," she said, though a part of her was reluctant to leave. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let me walk you home," he offered, his voice soft but insistent. Elena hesitated, her instincts warring with the magnetic pull she felt toward him. She had never been one to trust easily, especially not someone she'd just met. But there was something about Lucas, something that made her feel safe, even as the shadows around them seemed to deepen. "All right," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas offered her his arm, and she took it, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the chill in the air. As they stepped outside, the night was still, the streets cloaked in an eerie silence. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. Elena glanced over her shoulder, the feeling of being watched creeping back. She quickened her pace, Lucas matching her stride effortlessly. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, unable to shake the sensation that something or someone was following them. When they reached her apartment building, Elena turned to Lucas, searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful, Elena," he said, his tone grave. "Not everything is as it seems." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Elena stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where he had been. A sense of foreboding settled over her, heavy and unshakable. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, the feeling only grew stronger. Inside, she found her studio untouched, but something felt off. The air was colder, the silence more oppressive. She glanced at the mirror on the wall, its surface reflecting her pale, uneasy expression. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something move behind her, a shadow, darker than the rest. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Shaking her head, she told herself it was just her imagination. Yet deep down she knew. Something had changed. Something had awakened. Chapter 2. The shattered reflection, the morning light filtered through the curtains of Elena's studio, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. She sat at her easel, brush in hand, but her mind was far from her work. The events of the previous night lingered in her thoughts like a bad dream, the strange painting, Lucas Blackwood, the feeling of being watched. She shook her head, trying to focus, but the unease refused to leave her. Her reflection in the mirror across the room caught her eye, and for a moment she thought it moved independently. She blinked, and the moment passed. The studio was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves outside the window. Elena tried to lose herself in her painting, but the colors seemed to bleed together in ways she hadn't intended, forming shapes that made her uncomfortable. She wiped her brush clean, leaning back in her chair with a sigh. Her gaze drifted to the mirror again, its surface gleaming faintly in the sunlight. It was an antique piece, large and ornate, with a frame carved with intricate patterns of vines and thorns. She'd always loved it, but now it felt as though it was staring back at her. As the hours passed, Elena became increasingly restless. The feeling of being watched had followed her home, and it was worse now, more pronounced. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the result of a stressful night. But when she turned to the mirror again, she froze. Something was different. The reflection wasn't hers. It was her, but wrong. The eyes were darker, the expression twisted into a sinister smile. Elena stumbled back, her heart pounding. Before she could process what she'd seen, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, glass shards exploding outward as if propelled by an unseen force. Elena screamed, throwing her arms up to shield her face. When the noise subsided, she lowered her arms, trembling. The mirror was in pieces, shards scattered across the floor. But among the glass, something caught her eye, a piece of paper, folded neatly, resting where the mirror had once hung. She hesitated, then stepped forward to pick it up. Unfolding the paper, Elena's hands shook. The message was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "You are not alone." Her breath caught in her throat, and she dropped the paper as if it burned her. The words echoed in her mind, their meaning unclear but deeply unsettling. She backed away from the shattered glass, her mind racing. Was this a prank? A warning? Or something far more sinister? She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed Lucas's number. She didn't know why she trusted him, but she needed answers. "Elena," he answered on the third ring, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" She struggled to find the words, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Lucas finally spoke, his tone was grave. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." The call ended before she could protest, and Elena was left standing in the middle of her studio, the shattered mirror and cryptic message at her feet. When Lucas arrived, he examined the scene with a quiet intensity that unnerved her. He crouched down, picking up the piece of paper with the message. His expression darkened as he read it, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a prank," he said, his voice low. "Someone or something is trying to communicate with you." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling more vulnerable than ever. "But what does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure yet," Lucas admitted, standing and pocketing the paper. "But we need to be careful. Things like this, they don't happen without a reason." He turned to her, his gaze steady but filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear? Determination? "Have you noticed anything else strange? Anything out of the ordinary?" Elena hesitated, then told him about the painting at the gallery, how it had seemed to watch her, how it had appeared without her knowledge. Lucas listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "It's connected," he said finally. "I can't explain how yet, but it is." He glanced around the studio, his eyes lingering on the shattered mirror. "This place isn't safe," he said firmly. "You shouldn't stay here alone." Elena nodded, though the thought of leaving her sanctuary filled her with unease. "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My place," Lucas said without hesitation. "It's secure, and I have resources to help us figure this out." Elena hesitated, torn between fear and caution. She barely knew this man, yet she felt inexplicably drawn to him. "All right," she agreed finally, her voice soft. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Pack what you need," he said. "We'll leave as soon as possible." As Elena gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, their movements subtle but deliberate. She hurried, stuffing clothes and essentials into a bag, her heart racing. When she was ready, Lucas led her out of the studio, his hand resting lightly on her back. The touch was comforting, yet it did little to ease her anxiety. As they stepped outside, the air was colder than it had been earlier, the sky overcast and heavy with impending rain. Elena glanced back at her building, a sense of foreboding settling over her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed. The curse, if that's what it was, had found her, and there was no escaping it. She took a deep breath, following Lucas to his car, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows seemed to follow her, their presence a constant reminder that she was no longer alone. Chapter 3. The shadows embraced Lucas's apartment was a stark contrast to Elena's studio, dark, minimalist, and filled with an air of secrecy. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents an eclectic mix of ancient tomes, modern thrillers, and obscure texts on the occult. A large desk sat in the corner, cluttered with notes, maps, and strange artifacts. Elena hesitated in the doorway, feeling out of place. Lucas glanced at her, his expression softening. "Make yourself at home," he said, gesturing to the couch. She nodded, forcing a smile, though the weight of the past few days still pressed heavily on her. As the evening wore on, Lucas busied himself in the kitchen, preparing tea while Elena sat on the couch, her gaze wandering the room. The shadows seemed deeper here, more pronounced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were alive, watching, waiting. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled in her bones. When Lucas returned, he handed her a steaming cup of tea, his eyes searching her face. "You look pale," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Are you sure you're all right?" Elena nodded, taking a sip of the tea. The warmth spread through her, but it did little to ease her anxiety. I can't stop thinking about the mirror," she admitted, her voice trembling. "And that message. Who or what could be trying to communicate with me?" Lucas sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I've seen things like this before. Strange occurrences, cryptic messages. They're usually tied to something deeper, something much older than we realize." Elena's stomach twisted, her mind racing with possibilities. "Do you think it's a curse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible. Curses often target those with something special, something that draws attention." He looked at her, his gaze piercing. "You're a breathtaking artist, Elena. Your talent, your beauty, it could make you a target." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. As the night deepened, the air in the apartment grew heavier, the shadows seeming to creep closer. Elena noticed small details that made her uneasy: the way the light flickered, the faint whispers she couldn't quite place, the feeling of eyes on her whenever Lucas wasn't looking. She tried to brush it off, attributing it to her heightened nerves, but the unease refused to leave her. Lucas, too, seemed on edge, his gaze constantly darting to the corners of the room. When they finally retired for the night, Elena found herself unable to sleep. The guest room was comfortable enough, but the shadows here felt darker, more oppressive. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. The shattered mirror, the cryptic message, the eerie painting, it all felt connected, but she couldn't see the thread. Exhausted, she closed her eyes, only to jolt awake moments later. Something had touched her. She sat up, her heart pounding, and scanned the room. It was empty, the shadows still and silent. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling lingered, a cold, tingling sensation on her skin. She wrapped the blanket tightly around herself, trying to shake the unease. But as she lay back down, she saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, detached itself from the wall and moved toward her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow loomed over her, its form shifting and indistinct, yet undeniably humanoid. It reached out, its edges wavering like smoke, and Elena felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if it was draining the warmth from her body. She wanted to scream, to move, but she was paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as the shadow leaned closer, its face inches from hers. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness. Elena bolted upright, her heart racing. She scrambled out of bed, her legs trembling as she made her way to the door. She needed to find Lucas. She burst into the hallway, nearly colliding with him as he emerged from his room. "Elena?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "It was here," she gasped, her voice shaking. "A shadow, it touched me." Lucas's expression darkened, and he led her back to the living room, turning on every light as they went. When they were seated, he studied her face, his brow furrowed. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Elena recounted the experience, her words tumbling out in a rush. When she finished, Lucas leaned back, his jaw tight. "This is worse than I thought," he murmured. "The shadows, they're not just watching. They're taking form." "What does that mean?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his expression grim. "It means whatever's after you is gaining strength. It's feeding off your fear, your energy." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "We need to figure out how to stop it before it's too late." Elena nodded, though the thought filled her with dread. She didn't know what they were up against, but she knew one thing. She couldn't fight it alone. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, the two of them sitting in the living room, the lights on full blast. Elena's mind raced with questions, but she was too exhausted to voice them. Lucas remained vigilant, his gaze constantly scanning the room, as if expecting the shadows to return. As dawn approached, Elena finally dozed off, her head resting on Lucas's shoulder. He didn't move, his thoughts consumed by the darkness that had invaded their lives and the secrets that still lay hidden. Chapter 4. The veil thins. The morning light filtering through the curtains was weak and gray, the sun obscured by heavy clouds. Elena woke with a start, her body stiff from sleeping on the couch. Lucas was still beside her, his posture rigid as if he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were fixed on the window, his expression unreadable. "Did you see anything else?" he asked without turning to her, his voice low and gravelly. Elena shook her head, though the memory of the shadow lingered, cold and suffocating. As the day began, Lucas moved with purpose, gathering books and notes from his shelves and spreading them across the desk. Elena watched him, feeling useless and out of place. "What are you looking for?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Answers," he replied, his tone clipped. "There has to be something in these texts that can explain what's happening." He glanced at her, his gaze softening slightly. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to, but I'd feel better if you did." Elena nodded, though the thought of leaving Lucas's apartment filled her with dread. She wandered the room, her fingers brushing against the spines of old books, their titles in languages she couldn't understand. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. She paused by a large leather-bound tome, its cover embossed with strange symbols. "What's this?" she asked, lifting it carefully. Lucas glanced over, his expression darkening. "That's one of the oldest texts I own. It's about curses. Be careful with it, some of these books are dangerous." The words sent a chill down Elena's spine, and she placed the book back on the shelf with trembling hands. She turned to Lucas, her anxiety bubbling to the surface. "Do you really think this is a curse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then nodded. "The signs are all their strange occurrences, shadows taking form, cryptic messages. Something is targeting you, and it's not human." Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. "But why me? What did I do to deserve this?" Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Curses don't always have a reason," he said, his voice softer now. "Sometimes they just happen. Or sometimes they're passed down through generations, lying dormant until they find the right person to latch onto." He looked at her, his gaze piercing. "Has anything like this ever happened to your family? Any strange stories or unexplained deaths?" Elena shook her head, though a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Her grandmother had always been superstitious, but she'd never mentioned anything like this. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew thicker, the shadows seeming to press closer despite the light. Lucas pored over the texts, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Elena sat on the couch, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air felt colder now, the silence heavy and oppressive. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill. Suddenly, the lights flickered, startling them both. Elena froze, her heart pounding as the room was plunged into darkness. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. She heard him move, his footsteps quick and purposeful. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice calm but urgent. The lights flickered again, then remained off, the room illuminated only by the weak gray light from the window. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes darting around the room as the shadows seemed to close in. Then she saw it, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing in the corner of the room. Its form shifted and wavered, but its presence was undeniable. Elena's throat tightened, and she tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure moved toward her, its movement slow and deliberate, and she felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if it was draining the warmth from her body. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen in place, unable to do anything but watch as it drew closer. Before it could reach her, Lucas stepped in front of her, his posture tense and defensive. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice low and commanding. The shadow paused, its form wavering as if considering his words. Then, with a sound like a whisper on the wind, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness. The room was silent, the air heavy and still. Elena gasped, her body trembling as the fear began to ebb away. Lucas turned to her, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Elena nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. What was that?" she whispered. Lucas hesitated, then sighed. "A manifestation of the curse," he said, his voice grim. "It's gaining strength, feeding off your fear. We need to figure out how to stop it before it's too late." The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence, the two of them working together to comb through the texts for answers. Elena's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her mind racing with questions. What had she done to deserve this? How could they possibly fight something they couldn't even see? Lucas was quiet, his focus entirely on the task at hand, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. As night fell, the shadows in the room seemed darker, more pronounced. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She tried to focus on the texts, but the words blurred together, their meanings lost in the chaos of her thoughts. Lucas stayed close, his presence a small comfort in the face of the unknown. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of the curse grew heavier, its presence a constant reminder that time was running out. Chapter 5. The hidden truth. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound in the room, its warm glow doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over them. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open books and scattered notes. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop not when the curse seemed to be closing in on her. Lucas sat across from her, his face pale and drawn, his gaze fixed on the ancient text in his hands. "There's something here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But it's not clear." Elena looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope and fear. Lucas turned the book toward her, pointing to a passage written in jagged, faded letters. "It mentions a curse tied to a specific bloodline," he explained. "One that's activated by a trigger, usually a significant event or discovery." He glanced at her, his expression grave. "Think, Elena, has anything unusual happened recently? Something that might have started all this?" She frowned, her mind racing. "Nothing comes to mind," she said softly. "I've just been working on my art." "That's it." Lucas leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "It could be something subtle," he said. "Something you didn't think was important at the time." Elena hesitated, then remembered the painting at the gallery, the one she hadn't created. "The painting," she whispered. "The one that appeared at my exhibition. I didn't paint it. I don't even know how it got there." Lucas's eyes lit up, and he leaned forward, his intensity startling her. "That could be it," he said. "The curse might have been dormant until you encountered the painting." He grabbed another book, flipping through the pages with urgency. "If we can figure out where the painting came from, we might be able to trace the curse back to its source." Elena nodded, though the thought of delving deeper into the mystery filled her with dread. As the night wore on, they pieced together fragments of information, their discoveries only deepening the mystery. The painting, it seemed, was tied to an old legend, a story about a cursed family and a dark forest that devoured those who entered. "The figure in the painting," Lucas said, his voice low. "It's said to be the embodiment of the curse, a shadow that haunts the family until it claims their soul." Elena shivered, the memory of the shadow in her room fresh in her mind. Lucas closed the book, his expression grim. "We need to find the forest," he said. "If the legend is true, the curse's source is there." Elena's eyes widened. "You mean we have to go there?" Lucas nodded. "It's the only way to break the curse. But it's dangerous, very dangerous." Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't want to face whatever was waiting in that forest, but she knew she had no choice. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady despite her fear. The next morning, they set out, the air thick with tension. The forest wasn't far, just a few hours' drive from the city, but the journey felt like an eternity. Elena stared out the window, her hands clutching the edge of her seat as the landscape grew darker, the trees thicker and more twisted. The sky was overcast, the light weak and gray, and the road was eerily empty. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "The legend says the forest is hidden, only revealing itself to those it wants to find." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's a trap, Elena. The curse wants us here, but we have to go anyway." Elena nodded, though the thought filled her with dread. She didn't know what awaited them in the forest, but she knew one thing. She couldn't back down now. When they finally arrived, the forest loomed before them, its trees gnarled and twisted, their branches like claws reaching for the sky. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was suffocating. Elena hesitated at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you sure this is the place?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded, his expression grim. "This is it." They stepped into the forest, the shadows closing around them like a shroud. The trees seemed to shift as they walked, their roots coiling like serpents, their whispers faint but insistent. Elena stayed close to Lucas, her hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket, her eyes darting around nervously. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the light filtering through the leaves weak and greenish. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Elena's spine. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same figure from the painting, the cloaked figure with the obscured face, its presence radiating a cold, malevolent energy. Elena's legs felt like they might give out, but Lucas stepped in front of her, his posture tense and defensive. "Stay back," he warned, his voice low and commanding. The figure stopped, its form wavering as if considering his words. Then, with a sound like a whisper on the wind, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice hollow and echoing. "The forest claims what it wants, and it will not let go." Lucas didn't flinch, his gaze steady. "We're here to break the curse," he said, "and we're not leaving until we do." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "Then you will suffer," it said, before dissolving into the shadows once more. Chapter 6. The forest's echo. The forest seemed to breathe around them, its ancient trees creaking and groaning as if alive. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the shadows twisted and shifted unnaturally. Elena clung to Lucas's arm, her heart pounding as they pressed forward. The cloaked figure's warning echoed in her mind, its hollow voice sending shivers down her spine. "We need to keep moving," Lucas said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay close to me." The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches forming unnatural shapes that resembled grasping hands. The ground was soft and wet, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of moss and decaying leaves. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her fear growing with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed by something just beyond the edge of her vision. "Do you feel it too?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded, his gaze darting around the forest. "The forest is alive," he said, his voice grim. "It's testing us, trying to wear us down." We can't let it. Elena nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The forest seemed to hum with an eerie energy, its presence pressing down on her like a weight. They came across a clearing, the ground littered with ancient, weathered stones that formed a crude circle. In the center stood a lone tree, its trunk twisted and blackened, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air here was colder, the silence more absolute. Elena hesitated, a sense of dread washing over her. "This place, it feels wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his expression grim. "This is the heart of the forest," he said, "where the curse began." As they stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, the stones rattling as if stirred by an unseen force. A low, guttural growl filled the air, and Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadows around them began to coalesce, forming shapes that were vaguely humanoid but twisted and unnatural. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice tense. The figures closed in, their forms shifting and wavering like smoke, their hollow eyes fixed on Elena. She felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if they were draining the warmth from her body. Lucas raised his hand, muttering something under his breath, and a faint glow emanated from his palm. The figures hesitated, their forms wavering, but they didn't retreat. "They're drawn to you," Lucas said, his voice strained. "You need to focus, remember why we're here." Elena nodded, though her mind was racing with fear. She tried to focus, to remember the reason they had come to break the curse, to free herself from the shadow's grasp. But the fear was overwhelming, and the figures seemed to grow stronger, their forms solidifying with every moment. Lucas's glow flickered, his energy waning, and Elena realized they were running out of time. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the clearing, and the ground beneath them split open, a deep chasm forming between them and the figures. The shadows hesitated, their forms wavering as if unsure how to proceed. Elena stumbled back, her heart pounding, as Lucas grabbed her hand. "Run!" he shouted, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing. She didn't need to be told twice, her legs moving on their own as they fled into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them as they ran, their branches reaching out like claws, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. Elena's lungs burned, her legs aching, but she couldn't stop. The forest was alive, and it was trying to trap them. Lucas led the way, his grip on her hand firm and reassuring, but she could see the fear in his eyes. They were deep in the forest now, and there was no turning back. They finally stopped at the base of a massive tree, its trunk wider than any Elena had ever seen. The bark was gnarled and twisted, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Lucas knelt down, examining the symbols with a frown. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The source of the curse." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas hesitated, then looked at her, his expression grave. "We have to destroy it," he said. "But it won't be easy. The forest will fight back." Elena nodded, though the thought filled her with dread. She didn't know how they could possibly destroy something so ancient, so powerful, but she knew they had to try. Lucas placed his hand on the tree, muttering something under his breath, and the symbols began to glow faintly. The forest seemed to roar in response, the trees creaking and groaning as if in pain. The shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into the twisted figures they had seen in the clearing. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs trembling as she stepped back. "We need to hurry," Lucas said, his voice tense, "before the forest overwhelms us." Elena nodded, though her fear was overwhelming. The forest was alive, and it was angry. Chapter 7. The Tree of Shadows. The massive tree loomed before them, its gnarled trunk radiating a malevolent energy that made the air feel heavy and suffocating. The symbols carved into its bark pulsed faintly, casting an eerie glow that seemed to pierce the shadows. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding as she stared at the tree. It felt alive, as if it was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. Lucas placed his hand on the trunk, his expression grim. "This is it," he said softly. "The heart of the curse." Elena swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "How do we destroy it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas hesitated, then pulled a small vial from his pocket. Inside was a dark liquid that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This is a mixture of salt, iron, and herbs," he explained. "It's used to purify and weaken curses. But it's not enough on its own. We'll need to combine it with something else, something personal to the curse's victim." Elena frowned, her mind racing. "Something personal?" she repeated. Lucas nodded. "It could be a lock of hair, a drop of blood. Something that ties you directly to the curse." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What do we do?" Lucas handed her the vial. "Pour this onto the roots of the tree," he said. "I'll handle the rest." Elena took the vial, her grip tight, and knelt beside the tree. As she uncorked the vial, the forest seemed to react, the shadows around them twisting and shifting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Elena's hands shook as she poured the liquid onto the roots, the dark liquid seeping into the earth with a hiss. The tree shuddered, its branches creaking and groaning as if in pain. Lucas knelt beside her, pulling a small knife from his pocket. "I need something from you," he said, his voice low. "A drop of blood." Elena hesitated, then nodded, extending her hand. Lucas made a small cut on her palm, catching the blood in a small vial. The tree roared in response, its branches lashing out as if trying to strike them. Lucas stood, his expression focused, and poured the blood onto the roots. The tree shuddered violently, its trunk cracking and splitting as the curse began to weaken. The symbols on its bark dimmed, their glow fading. But the forest wasn't done fighting. The shadows around them began to coalesce, forming into the twisted figures they had seen before. Their hollow eyes fixed on Elena, and she felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if they were draining the warmth from her body. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice tense, "before the forest overwhelms us." Elena nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Lucas placed his hand on the tree, muttering something under his breath, and the symbols on its bark began to glow faintly once more. The tree shuddered, its branches lashing out wildly as the forest roared in response. Elena stepped back, her heart pounding, as Lucas continued his incantation, his voice growing louder and more urgent. The twisted figures closed in, their forms wavering like smoke, their hollow eyes fixed on Elena. She felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if they were draining the warmth from her body. Lucas's incantation grew louder, his voice echoing through the forest, and the tree began to crack and split, its trunk crumbling as the curse weakened. The figures hesitated, their forms wavering, but they didn't retreat. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, and the tree split in two, its trunk crumbling to the ground with a deafening crash. The shadows around them began to dissipate, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The forest was silent, the air heavy and still. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs trembling as she stared at the remains of the tree. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "The heart of the curse is destroyed," he said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "But we're not out of the forest yet." Elena nodded, though her body felt weak and drained. The forest seemed quieter now, the shadows less oppressive, but the air was still heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The forest won't let us go easily." They stepped away from the remains of the tree, the forest seeming to shift and twist around them as they walked. The trees were still gnarled and twisted, but the shadows no longer seemed alive, no longer seemed to be watching them. Elena stayed close to Lucas, her hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket, her mind racing with questions. What had just happened? Was the curse truly broken? The forest was silent, but the silence felt heavy and oppressive. As they walked, the forest began to thin, the trees growing less dense and the light filtering through the leaves growing stronger. Elena's legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she forced herself to keep moving. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. But finally, they emerged from the trees, the open sky above them a sight for sore eyes. Elena collapsed onto the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared up at the sky. Lucas knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," he said softly. "The curse is broken." Chapter 8. Aftermath and doubts. The drive back to the city was silent, the weight of what they had just been through hanging heavy in the air. Elena stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. The forest had been left behind, but its shadows seemed to cling to her, lingering in the corners of her vision. She felt numb, her body exhausted and her emotions frayed. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry etched into his face. When they finally arrived at Lucas's apartment, Elena stepped inside, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. The place felt different now, as if the darkness they had faced had left a permanent mark. She sank onto the couch, her legs trembling, and buried her face in her hands. Lucas sat beside her, his presence steadying but distant. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft and hesitant. Elena nodded, though the word felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she was all right or if she ever would be. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's over," he said, his voice firm but weary. "The curse is broken. You're safe now." Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "The heart of the curse was destroyed. The forest won't haunt you anymore." Elena nodded, though the words didn't bring her the comfort she had hoped for. Something still felt off. As the hours passed, the silence between them grew heavier, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. Lucas busied himself with cleaning up his apartment, his movements methodical but tense. Elena watched him from the couch, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite put into words. She wanted to believe that the curse was gone, that she was free, but the shadows in her mind refused to fade. "Lucas," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. What if it's not over?" Lucas paused, his back to her, and sighed. "The curse is gone," he said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. But he turned to face her, his expression grim. "Curses leave scars. They're not just physical, they're emotional, psychological. It's going to take time for you to heal." Elena nodded, though the thought filled her with dread. She didn't know how to heal from something she couldn't fully understand. That night, Elena lay on the couch, sleep eluding her. The apartment was quiet, but her mind was anything but. Every creak, every whisper of wind, made her heart race, her body tensing as if expecting an attack. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. Finally, she sat up, her legs trembling, and reached for a glass of water. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to shift as she moved, and she froze, her breath caught in her throat. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Elena?" he asked, his voice soft. She turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "I can feel it." Lucas stepped closer, his gaze searching her face. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The curse is gone. The forest didn't follow us." Elena shook her head, though she couldn't explain what she was feeling. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. I feel like it's still here." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Curses have a way of worming into your mind," he said, his voice gentle. "It's going to take time for you to feel safe again." Elena nodded, though the words didn't bring her comfort. She wanted to believe that everything was over, that she could move on with her life, but the fear lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." Elena nodded, though the doubts in her mind refused to fade. The next morning, Elena woke with a start, her heart pounding as if she had been running from something. The sunlight streaming through the windows offered little comfort, the shadows in the room seeming darker, more pronounced. She got up, her legs trembling, and wandered into the kitchen, where Lucas was already awake, a cup of coffee in hand. "Did you sleep?" she asked, her voice soft. Lucas shook his head, his expression grim. "Not really," he admitted. "I've been thinking." Elena frowned, her mind racing with possibilities. "About what?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas hesitated, then sighed. "About the curse," he said. "I keep wondering, did we really destroy it? Or did we just weaken it?" Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked at her, his expression serious. "I'm saying that there might be more to this than we realized. Curses like this, they don't just disappear. They linger." Elena sank into a chair, her legs trembling, as the weight of his words settled over her. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas hesitated, then sat across from her, his expression grim. "We need to be vigilant," he said. "Watch for signs, anything unusual, anything out of the ordinary. If the curse is still active, we'll figure it out. And if it's not, well, we'll know you're safe." Elena nodded, though the doubts in her mind refused to fade. She didn't know what to believe anymore. As the day passed, the tension in the apartment grew heavier, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. Elena tried to distract herself, to focus on anything but the curse, but the shadows in the corners of her vision refused to fade. Lucas stayed close, his presence steadying but distant, his mind clearly occupied with the same thoughts. They were caught in a limbo, unsure of whether the curse was truly gone or if it was simply biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 9. The return of the shadows. Elena's days blurred into a cycle of unease and uncertainty. Though Lucas assured her the curse was broken, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The apartment, once a safe haven, now felt like a prison, its shadows stretching unnaturally long and its silence heavy with unspoken dread. She avoided the mirrors, terrified of what she might see in their reflections, and kept the lights on at all times, as if the darkness itself were a threat. Lucas stayed close, his presence reassuring but equally on edge. Neither of them spoke of the growing tension, but it lingered, unignorable. One evening, as the sun set and the city outside grew quiet, Elena sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The screen flickered with static, though the channel was supposedly fine. Lucas was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when the lights suddenly dimmed, their brightness fading to a faint, sickly glow. Elena froze, her heart racing, as the air grew colder, the familiar chill of the forest creeping into the room. "Lucas," she called, her voice trembling. "Something's happening." Lucas appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. "What is it?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. Elena pointed to the lights, her hand shaking. "The lights, they just dimmed on their own. And it's cold, can't you feel it?" Lucas frowned, stepping into the room, and she could see the moment he felt it too, his body stiffening. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice low. "Stay close to me." The shadows in the room began to move, shifting unnaturally, their edges blurring as if they were alive. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs trembling as she backed toward Lucas. Is it back?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the shadows as they began to coalesce, forming vaguely humanoid shapes that seemed to watch them with hollow, sightless eyes. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping so quickly that Elena could see her breath in the dim light. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. Elena nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. They made it to the hallway, the door slamming shut behind them, but the cold followed, the shadows stretching under the fluorescent lights like tendrils of darkness. The stairs were just ahead, and Lucas led the way, his grip on her arm firm and reassuring. As they descended the stairs, the whispers began soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elena's heart pounded, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she clung to Lucas. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I thought it was gone." Lucas didn't answer, his focus entirely on getting them out of the building. When they finally emerged into the cool night air, Elena expected to feel relief, but the chill followed them, the shadows shifting unnaturally beneath the streetlights. They hurried down the street, the city around them eerily quiet despite the late hour. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Elena felt a coldness seep into her chest, as if the shadows were reaching for her. Lucas pulled her into an alley, his expression grim. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice low. "This isn't normal even for a curse." Elena nodded, though her mind was racing with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas hesitated, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through the pages with urgency. "There's something I missed," he muttered, his eyes scanning the text. "A detail, a clue." His voice trailed off as he stopped on a page, his expression darkening. "Elena," he said, his voice tense, "the curse wasn't just tied to the tree. It was tied to you." She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas looked at her, his expression grim. "The curse wasn't just about the forest, it was about you. Your bloodline, your family. That's why it's still here." Elena's legs felt like they might give out, her mind racing with questions she couldn't quite articulate. "My family," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Lucas nodded. "The curse wasn't just destroyed by destroying the tree. It's tied to your blood. We need to find out more about your family history. There's something there, something we're missing." Elena sank against the wall, her legs trembling, as the weight of his words settled over her. "I don't know anything about my family," she said, her voice trembling. "My parents never talked about it. They died when I was young." Lucas frowned, then nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "But we need to act fast. The curse isn't going to wait." Elena nodded, though the doubts in her mind refused to fade. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let the curse win. They spent the rest of the night in a diner, the harsh fluorescent lights offering little comfort but keeping the shadows at bay. Lucas worked through his notes, his expression focused, while Elena sat across from him, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step from falling into the abyss. "We'll figure this out," Lucas said finally, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "We'll find out what's tied to you, and we'll break it once and for all." Elena nodded, though her fear lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She didn't know what they would find, but she knew one thing. The curse wasn't gone. It was still here, still waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed her. As the night wore on, the shadows outside the diner seemed to grow darker, more pronounced, their edges blurring as if they were alive. Elena stared out the window, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Chapter 10. Breaking the curse. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the city as Elena and Lucas stood outside the archives building. It was an old, decrepit structure, its walls lined with decades of dust and neglect, but it held the key to unraveling the curse. Elena felt a knot of fear and anticipation tighten in her chest as Lucas pulled open the rusted door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew, the rows of shelves stretching endlessly into the shadows. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice steady. "We'll find the answers here." They moved through the archives with urgency, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Lucas led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they searched for anything related to Elena's family. Hours passed, the minutes blending together as they sifted through records, documents, and faded photographs. Elena's hands trembled as she held a crumbling ledger, her eyes scanning the names for anything familiar. Finally, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My grandmother's name and something beneath it." Lucas leaned over her shoulder, his flashlight illuminating the page. Scrawled in faded ink was her grandmother's name, followed by a single word, marked. Elena's heart pounded, her mind racing as she turned the page, revealing a detailed account of a centuries-old pact. The words were cryptic, but one thing was clear. The curse was tied to her family through a contract made long ago. "A blood pact," Lucas muttered, his voice grim. "This is why the curse is so strong. It's not just a curse, it's a debt." Elena's hands shook as she read the details, her heart sinking with each word. The pact had been made by her ancestor, a desperate act to save their family from ruin, but the cost had been steep. The curse had been passed down through generations, its darkness lying dormant until it found a suitable hoster. "This is why I've been marked," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not just me, it's my entire family." Lucas nodded, his expression grim. "We need to break the pact," he said. "But it won't be easy." They gathered their findings and left the archives, the weight of what they had discovered heavy on their shoulders. The sun was higher now, its light offering little comfort as they made their way to Lucas's apartment. Elena's mind raced with questions, her fear mingling with a desperate hope. She didn't know if they could break the curse, but she knew they had to try. When they arrived at the apartment, Lucas immediately began preparing for the ritual, his movements focused and deliberate. Elena watched in silence, her heart pounding as she braced herself for what was to come. Lucas set up a makeshift altar in the center of the room, the items arranged with careful precision. Candles flickered in the dim light, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the center of the altar was a small bowl filled with herbs, salt, and a drop of Elena's blood, the last ingredient needed to break the pact. Lucas placed his hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "This is going to hurt," he warned, his voice soft. "But it's the only way." Elena nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Lucas began the ritual, his voice low and steady as he chanted in a language she didn't understand. The air grew heavier, the candles flickering wildly as the shadows in the room began to twist and shift. Elena felt a coldness seep into her chest, her body trembling as the curse fought to resist the ritual. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, their voices a cacophony of fear and anger. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to stay still. Lucas's voice grew louder, more urgent, and the room seemed to tremble in response. The shadows coalesced into familiar shapes, their hollow eyes fixed on Elena as they reached for her. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something were being torn from her, and she cried out, her voice swallowed by the chaos. Lucas gripped her hand, his voice steady as he continued the incantation. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm. "We're almost there." The shadows surged forward, their forms solidifying as they tried to break through the circle. Elena felt a wave of fear and despair wash over her, but she clung to Lucas's hand, his presence grounding her. The pain in her chest grew unbearable, her vision blurring as the curse fought to cling to her. She felt like she was being torn apart, her body and soul caught in a battle she couldn't win. But then, suddenly, there was a flash of light, and the shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The room fell silent, the candles flickering gently as the tension in the air dissipated. Elena collapsed into Lucas's arms, her body trembling as the pain in her chest faded. She felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. Lucas held her tightly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's over," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The curse is broken." Elena nodded, though her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She felt exhausted, her body and soul drained, but there was a sense of relief she couldn't put into words. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For everything." Lucas nodded, his grip on her tightening. "We did it together," he said. "You're free now." As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the city, Elena and Lucas sat in silence, their hands still intertwined. The battles they had fought had left scars, but they had also forged a bond that couldn't be broken. For the first time, Elena felt like she could breathe, like she could finally move forward. The curse was gone, but its lessons remained, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and the strength she had found. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. And that, more than anything, gave her hope. Crimson Elegy. Chapter 1. The Dance of Shadows. The theater loomed like a relic of another era, its once gilded walls now cloaked in shadows and decay. The storm outside howled, its fury rattling the stained glass windows that lined the upper balcony. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp velvet, a fragrance that whispered of forgotten performances and buried secrets. Sophia Loren stood alone on the stage, her lithe figure bathed in the pale glow of a single spotlight. She was ethereal, a living dream, her presence so commanding that even the shadows seemed to lean in to watch. Sophia was performing Swan Lake, her movements a delicate balance of power and fragility. Her arms flowed like water, her feet barely touching the ground as she spun. The music swelled, a mournful crescendo that seemed to echo the storm outside. Adrian Graves sat in the third row, his camera poised. He had come to capture the beauty of the performance, but his lens was drawn to something else, a darkness that lingered in the corners of the theater, something alive and restless. Adrian adjusted the focus, his eye pressed to the viewfinder. Sophia was mesmerizing, the perfect subject, but something felt off. The shadows around her seemed to shift, as if they were alive. He snapped a photo, the shutters clicked barely audible over the music. When he reviewed the image, his breath caught. In the background, barely visible, was a figure sitting in the back row. It was a woman, her face obscured, but her posture was unnaturally rigid. Adrian frowned, glancing up at the empty seats. The storm outside intensified, the thunder shaking the walls. Adrian raised his camera again, drawn to Sophia's haunting beauty. As she leaped into the air, her arms extended like wings, he captured her mid-flight. The flash illuminated the stage for a fraction of a second, and that's when he saw it, the figure in the back row, now closer, her hollow eyes fixed on Sophia. Adrian's hand trembled as he lowered the camera, his heart pounding. Sophia continued to dance, unaware of the unease creeping through the theater. Adrian's gaze dotted between her and the shadows, searching for the figure. The music reached its crescendo, the strings wailing as Sophia collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with the weight of Odette's despair. The audience erupted into applause, but Adrian remained frozen, his mind replaying the image he had captured. Backstage, Sophia glowed with the exhilaration of the performance. Her laughter filled the dressing room, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the theater. Adrian entered, his camera slung over his shoulder, his expression troubled. He handed her a bouquet of roses, their deep crimson petals almost glowing in the dim light. "You were incredible," he said, his voice strained. Sophia smiled, but her eyes narrowed as she studied his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. Adrian hesitated, then handed her the camera. She scrolled through the photos, her smile fading as she reached the last one, the image of the figure in the back row. Her breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in on the woman's face. "Who is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Adrian admitted. "I didn't see her in the theater. She just appeared in the photo." Sophia's gaze lingered on the screen, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the room felt colder, the shadows pressing in around them. "I felt something during the performance," she said finally. "Like someone was watching me, closer than the audience. It was cold, like a hand brushing my shoulder." Adrian's unease deepened. He took the camera back, his eyes scanning the image once more. The figure's face was clearer now, her hollow cheeks and sunken eyes giving her the appearance of a corpse. But it was her gaze that chilled him, direct, unflinching, as if she could see him through the lens. "We should leave," he said, his voice tight. "This place, it doesn't feel right." Sophia nodded, her earlier joy replaced by a quiet fear. She gathered her things, her movements quick and deliberate. As they left the theater, Adrian glanced back at the stage, now shrouded in darkness. He could have sworn he saw a figure standing there, watching them leave. The woman from the photograph. Outside, the storm raged on, the rain lashing against the pavement. Adrian and Sophia hurried to his car, their breaths visible in the cold night air. As they drove away, Sophia turned to look at the theater one last time. In the upper window, she saw a face pale, gaunt, and utterly lifeless. The woman. The next morning, Adrian woke to a frantic call from Sophia. Her voice was trembling, barely audible. "Adrian, you need to come to my apartment. No. And bring the camera." When he arrived, she handed him a photograph, one she claimed she hadn't taken. It was a close-up of the figure from the theater, her skeletal hand reaching out as if to grab the viewer. Scrawled on the back, in jagged handwriting, were 3 words: "She has chosen Chapter 2. The blood-stained lens Adrian studio was a sanctuary of shadows and light, its walls adorned with black and white photographs that captured the macabre beauty of the world. The smell of developer chemicals hung in the air, mingling with a faint metallic tang that Adrian couldn't quite place. He sat at his desk, the photograph from Sophia's apartment spread out before him. The skeletal figure loomed in the frame, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was as if she was watching him, even now. Sophia stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked fragile, her usual radiance dimmed by the weight of what they'd discovered. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "And why does she keep appearing in your photos?" Adrian shook his head, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think she's connected to you. That handwritten note she has chosen. It's you she's after." Sophia turned to face him, her eyes wide with fear. "What does she want from me?" Adrian hesitated, his mind racing. He reached for his camera, scrolling through the photos he'd taken at the theater. One by one, he examined them, searching for clues. Then he saw it, a faint shadow in the corner of the stage, almost imperceptible. He zoomed in, his breath catching. It was the woman, her bony fingers reaching out toward Sophia as she danced. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Adrian printed the image, the ink pooling unnaturally in the figure's hollow eyes. He handed the photo to Sophia, his hands trembling. "She's been there all along," he said. "Watching you. Following you." Sophia stared at the photo, her face pale. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What did I do to deserve this?" Adrian didn't have an answer. He turned back to his desk, the photograph from Sophia's apartment catching his eye. The woman's hand, reaching out, seemed more pronounced now, as if she were trying to break free from the paper. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, and began to pack up his equipment. "We need to find out who she is," he said firmly. "And we need to stop her." Sophia nodded, her fear giving way to determination. Where do we start? Adrian glanced at the photograph again, his eyes narrowing. The locket, he said. You said you found it in your dressing room. Maybe it's connected to her. Sophia's hand instinctively went to her neck, where the locket now hung. It was cold against her skin, like a shard of ice. Let's go, she said, her voice steady. They left the studio, the streets eerily quiet as they made their way back to the theater. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy with the promise of rain. As they climbed the steps to the stage entrance, Adrian felt a familiar unease settle over him. The theater was silent, its emptiness oppressive. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking like a scream. Sophia led him to her dressing room, her steps cautious. The room was small, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected their distorted images. She opened a drawer, pulling out the locket. It was old, its silver surface tarnished with age. The front was intricately carved with a rose, its petals stained red. Adrian took it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. "This is it?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "It was just sitting here, waiting for me." Adrian examined the locket, his eyes drawn to the engraving on the back. It was a name, barely legible. Isabelle Laurent. His heart skipped a beat. "Isabelle Laurent," he read aloud. "That's your last name." Sophia's eyes widened. "It can't be a coincidence," she said. Adrian nodded, his mind racing. "She's your ancestor," he said. "And she's trying to tell us something." As he handed the locket back to Sophia, the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. The mirrors around them began to fog, their surfaces clouding over. Adrian turned, his heart pounding. In one of the mirrors, he saw the reflection of the woman Isabelle. She was standing behind Sophia, her hollow eyes locked on Adrian's. He spun around, but the space behind Sophia was empty. "Adrian." Sophia's voice was small, fearful. He turned back to the mirror, his breath catching. The woman was closer now, her skeletal hand reaching out toward Sophia's reflection. The locket in Sophia's hand began to grow cold, its icy touch spreading through her body. She dropped it, the locket clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and final. When the echoes faded, the room was silent once more. Adrian picked up the locket, his hands trembling. The engraving had changed. Now it read, "She will come for you." Sophia stared at the words, her face pale. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Adrian didn't answer. He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Isabelle Laurent was no longer just a ghost in a photograph. She was real, and she was coming for them. Chapter 3. The Curse Awakens. The locket lay on the table between them, its cold, tarnished surface seeming to radiate an ominous energy. Adrian and Sophia sat in silence, the weight of the engraving "She will come for you" hanging heavily in the air. The workshop lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Adrian picked up the locket again, turning it over in his hands. "Isabelle Laurent," he muttered, his voice low. "She was your ancestor, but why is she haunting us? What does she want?" Sophia's fingers trembled as she reached for the locket. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think she's trying to warn me. That day in the theater, when I felt that cold hand on my shoulder, it wasn't just fear. It was like she was trying to tell me something." Adrian's eyes narrowed. A warning? Or a threat? Sophia shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't know. I just know I can't ignore this anymore." Adrian stood, pacing the room. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the mystery. The photographs, the locket, the ghostly figure, it all had to be connected. He stopped abruptly, turning to Sophia. "We need to find out more about Isabelle. If she's your ancestor, there must be records somewhere. Maybe we can figure out why she's haunting us and how to stop her." Sophia nodded, her resolve hardening. "Where do we start?" The archives, Adrian said. If she lived in the 1800s, there might be something about her in the local records or old newspapers. We need to find out what happened to her and why she's tied to this locket. Sophia stood, clutching the locket tightly. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not waiting around for her to come for me again." The local archives were housed in a crumbling stone building on the edge of town. Its windows were smudged with age, and the air inside smelled of dust and decay. The archivist, an elderly woman with a stooped posture, eyed them suspiciously as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. Adrian explained their search, mentioning the name Isabelle Laurent. The woman's expression darkened. "Isabelle Laurent," she repeated, her tone heavy with unease. "That name hasn't been spoken in this town for a long time." She led them to a dusty corner of the archives, pulling out a faded ledger. "Her story is tragic," she said, flipping through the pages. "She was a dancer like you," she added, glancing at Sophia. "But her life was cut short by a jealous rival." The archivist's words sent a chill down Sophia's spine. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman sighed, her eyes distant. "There was a man, a painter. Isabelle loved him, but another woman was obsessed with him. When the painter chose Isabelle, the rival cursed her. They say the curse bound Isabelle's soul to the locket, and it's been passed down through generations of Laurent women ever since." Adrian exchanged a glance with Sophia, his expression grim. "The locket," he said. "It's not just a keepsake. It's a prison for her soul." Sophia's hand instinctively went to her neck, where the locket had hung just hours before. "But why is she haunting me?" she asked. The archivist's gaze was piercing. "Because the curse demands a sacrifice," she said. "Every generation, a Laurent woman must pay the price. And now, it's your turn." The weight of the archivist's words settled over them like a shroud. Sophia's legs felt weak, and she sank into a nearby chair. "What kind of sacrifice?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman's expression was somber. "A life," she said simply. "Her soul can only be freed if another takes her place." Adrian's fists clenched. "There has to be another way," he said. "We're not letting Sophia die for this." The archivist sighed, her gaze softening. "I don't know if there's another way," she admitted. "But if you want to fight the curse, you'll need to learn everything you can about it. Start with the locket, it holds the key." She handed them a fragile, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragic Death of Dancer Isabelle Laurent, 1847. Below it was a grainy portrait of a young woman who looked eerily like Sophia. As they left the archives, Sophia clutched the newspaper clipping tightly. The face staring back at her was hauntingly familiar, the same hollow eyes, the same delicate features. It was like looking into a mirror from another time. "She looks just like me," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. Adrian nodded, his jaw tight. "That's not a coincidence," he said. "This curse is tied to you, Sophia, and we're going to find a way to break it." That night, Sophia lay awake, the locket resting on her bedside table. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. She felt a cold breath on her neck, a whisper in the darkness. "She will come for you." Sophia froze, her heart pounding. In the mirror across the room, she saw the faint outline of a figure, Isabelle, her hollow eyes fixed on Sophia. The locket seemed to glow faintly, its crimson rose pulsing like a heartbeat. The curse was awake, and it was coming. Chapter 4. The whispered warning. The locket glowed faintly on the bedside table, its crimson rose pulsing like a heartbeat. Sophia stared at it, her body frozen in fear. The figure in the mirror, Isabelle, had vanished, leaving only a cold, empty reflection. But the whisper lingered in the air, haunting and insistent. "She will come for you." Sophia's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she reached for the locket, her fingers trembling. It was colder now, almost burning to the touch, as if it carried the chill of the grave. Adrian's voice crackled through the phone, his concern palpable. "Sophia, are you okay? You sound strange." She clutched the locket tighter, her voice barely a whisper. "She was here, Adrian. In my room. In the mirror." There was a pause on the other end, and she could hear the tension in his voice when he finally spoke. "I'm coming over. Don't open the door for anyone but me." By the time Adrian arrived, the sun was rising, its pale light casting long shadows through the windows of Sophia's apartment. He carried a leather satchel filled with old books and papers research he'd gathered on curses and the occult. "We need to figure out how to stop this," he said, his voice firm. "Before it's too late." Sophia nodded, her face pale and drawn. She handed him the locket, its glow now dim but still unsettling. Adrian examined the locket closely, turning it over in his hands. The engraving "She will come for you" seemed to shimmer faintly, as if alive. "This isn't just a curse," he said, his brow furrowed. "It's a warning. Isabel is trying to protect you, Sophia." "But from what?" Sophia shook her head, her mind racing. "From the woman who cursed her," she said softly. "The rival. Maybe she's not gone. Maybe she's still out there, waiting." Adrian's eyes narrowed as he set the locket down on the table. "We need to find out who she was," he said. "If we can break the connection between her and Isabel, maybe we can end this." He opened one of the books he'd brought, its pages yellowed and brittle. The text was dense and cryptic, filled with references to curses, spirits, and rituals. Sophia watched him silently, her unease growing with each passing moment. Hours passed as they sifted through the books and documents, searching for any mention of Isabel or the curse. The apartment grew colder, the shadows deeper. Finally, Adrian found a passage that made his blood run cold. "Listen to this," he said, his voice grim. "The curse of the locket binds the soul of the victim to the object, ensuring their torment for eternity. To break the curse, the blood of the rival must be spilled, and the locket destroyed in the flames of purification." Sophia's eyes widened. "The rival's blood? But she's been dead for over a century. How are we supposed to find her?" Adrian's expression was somber. "If the curse is still active, her spirit might still be out there somewhere. We'll need to find her and confront her." Sophia's heart pounded. "And if we can't? What happens then?" Adrian hesitated, his gaze dropping to the locket. "Then the curse continues. And you." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As night fell, the atmosphere in the apartment grew darker. The locket began to glow again, its crimson rose pulsing faintly. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "She is near." Adrian turned to her, his face pale. "We're running out of time," he said. "We need to act now." Sophia nodded, her resolve hardening. "Where do we start?" Adrian pulled out an old map of the town, its edges frayed and faded. "There's an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town," he said. "It was built in the 1800s, around the time Isabel died. If the rival spirit is still out there, that's where we'll find her." Sophia's stomach churned at the thought, but she nodded. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. The chapel was a crumbling ruin, its stone walls overgrown with ivy and moss. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the structure. Adrian and Sophia approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The locket in Sophia's hand began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening. "She's here," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. Inside the chapel, the air was colder, the shadows thicker. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes of angels and demons, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. At the altar stood a figure, a woman in a tattered gown, her face pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes fixed on Sophia, and a cruel smile twisted her lips. "So you've come," she said, her voice like a serpent's hiss. To fulfill the curse. Sophia's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, clutching the locket tightly. No, she said, her voice firm. We've come to end it. The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with malice. Foolish girl, she sneered. The curse cannot be broken. You will take her place, as it was meant to be. Adrian stepped beside Sophia, his voice steady. We won't let that happen, he said. We'll destroy the locket and you. The woman's laughter echoed through the chapel, cold and merciless. You are brave, she said, but bravery will not save you. Chapter 5. The chapel's secret. The woman's laughter echoed through the chapel, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the very bones of the structure. Her hollow eyes gleamed with malice as she stepped forward, her tattered gown trailing behind her like shadows given form. Sophia clutched the locket tightly, its cold metal biting into her palm. We're not afraid of you, she said, though her voice wavered. The woman's smile twisted into a sneer. You should be, she hissed. Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. We're here to end this. You don't control us. The woman's gaze shifted to him, her expression unreadable. You think you have the power to defy me? She asked, her tone mocking. You are merely pawns in a game that began long before you were born. Sophia's grip on the locket tightened. We're not pawns, she said, her voice gaining strength. We're going to break the curse with or without your help. The woman's laughter faded, replaced by a cold, calculating silence. She tilted her head, studying them with those hollow eyes. Very well, she said finally. If you wish to challenge the curse, you must prove yourselves worthy. The chapel holds the key if you can find it. Her form began to dissolve, her body fading into the shadows until only her voice remained. Time is running out. Sophia and Adrian exchanged a glance, the weight of the woman's words settling over them. The chapel was vast and ancient, its walls lined with crumbling frescoes and its floor littered with debris. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and the moonlight streaming through the broken windows cast eerie patterns on the ground. Where do we start? Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian's eyes scanned the room, finally landing on the altar. It was a massive stone structure, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. There, he said, pointing. If the chapel holds the key, it's probably hidden there. They approached the altar cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The locket in Sophia's hand began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening as they drew closer. The symbols on the altar were ancient, their meaning lost to time. Adrian traced them with his fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think these are instructions, he said. A ritual of some kind. Sophia leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carvings. What does it say? She asked. Adrian shook his head. I'm not sure, but I think it involves the locket. We might need to activate it. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Activate it? How? Adrian hesitated, his gaze dropping to the locket. It's tied to you, Sophia. It's been passed down through generations of Loron women. Maybe you're the key. She stared at him, her mind racing. You mean I have to use it? Channel its power. Adrian nodded, though his expression was grim. It's the only way we can find the key to breaking the curse. Sophia took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she held the locket. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of the curse within it. She closed her eyes, focusing on the cold metal against her skin. The air around her seemed to shift, growing colder and denser. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, their light casting strange shadows on the walls. A sudden gust of wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the moonlight and plunging the room into darkness. Sophia's eyes snapped open, but she could see nothing, only the faint glow of the locket in her hand. Adrian, she called, her voice trembling. I'm here, he replied, his voice close but unervingly distant. The locket's glow intensified, illuminating the altar and the symbols etched into its surface. The symbols began to move, their lines shifting and rearranging themselves into a new pattern. Sophia felt a pull, a strange force drawing her closer to the altar. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian's hand found hers, his grip firm but reassuring. "It's working," he said. "The locket, it's unlocking something." The symbols settled into their new pattern, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The altar split open with a deafening crack, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Inside was a small, ornate key, its surface etched with the same symbols as the locket. Sophia reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. As she lifted it from its resting place, the chapel began to shake, the walls groaning as if the structure itself was alive. The woman's voice echoed through the chapel once more, cold and merciless. "You've found the key," she said. "But the curse is far from broken. The final test awaits, and it will cost you everything." The ground beneath them gave way, and Sophia and Adrian fell into darkness, the locket's glow their only light. The chapel's secret had been revealed, but the true horror was just beginning. Chapter 6. The abyss below the fall seemed to last forever, the darkness swallowing them whole. Sophia clutched the locket and the key tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick and cold, carrying with it the scent of earth and something darker, something ancient. Adrian's voice cut through the void, sharp with urgency. "Stay close. Don't let go." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as they plummeted deeper into the abyss. When they finally landed, it was with a jarring thud that sent a shockwave through their bodies. They found themselves in a vast cavern, its walls lined with glowing bioluminescent fungi that cast an eerie green light. The air was damp and heavy, and a low, rhythmic sound echoed from somewhere in the distance like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Sophia staggered to her feet, her legs trembling. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian helped her up, his expression grim. "I think we're underground," he said, "beneath the chapel. This must be where Isabel was buried." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Her grave?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adrian nodded, his eyes scanning the cavern. "If this is where the curse began, it's also where we'll find the answers we need." The cavern stretched out before them, its walls narrowing into a tunnel that seemed to lead deeper into the earth. The rhythmic sound grew louder as they moved forward, its steady beat reverberating in their chests. Sophia clutched the key tightly, her fingers trembling. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Adrian nodded, his expression tense. "It's coming from up ahead," he said. "We need to be careful." As they ventured deeper, the walls of the cavern seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and denser with each step. The green light from the fungi faded, replaced by an unnatural darkness that seemed to press against them from all sides. The rhythmic sound was deafening now, a steady thrum that echoed in their minds. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "She is near." The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows. At the center of the room stood a stone sarcophagus, its surface carved with intricate symbols that matched those on the locket and the key. The rhythmic sound was emanating from the sarcophagus, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to vibrate through the air. Sophia's heart pounded as she approached it, her steps cautious. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian followed close behind, his eyes fixed on the sarcophagus. "This has to be Isabel's resting place," he said. "If we're going to break the curse, we'll need to open it." Sophia's hands trembled as she held the key. "What happens when we do?" she asked. Adrian's gaze was steady. "We'll find out," he said. "But we have to try. It's the only way to end this." They approached the sarcophagus, the rhythmic pulse growing louder with each step. The symbols on its surface seemed to writhe and shift, their lines rearranging themselves into a pattern that matched the key. Sophia took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the mechanism clicking as it turned. The sarcophagus began to open, its heavy stone lid sliding back with a deafening grind. The rhythmic pulse stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Inside the sarcophagus lay the skeletal remains of Isabelle Laurent, her tattered gown still clinging to her bones. The locket rested on her chest, its crimson rose glowing faintly. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "It's her," she whispered, her voice trembling. Adrian's expression was grim. "This is where it all began," he said. As they stared at Isabelle's remains, the air around them began to shift, growing colder and denser. The locket on her chest began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening. Sophia felt a pull, a strange force drawing her closer to the sarcophagus. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian's hand found hers, his grip firm. "The curse is reacting to the key," he said. "Stay with me." The locket's glow intensified, its light filling the chamber with an unnatural radiance. The skeletal remains of Isabelle began to stir, her hollow eyes turning to Sophia. A voice filled the air, cold and distant. "You have come." Sophia's heart pounded as she met Isabelle's gaze, her voice trembling. "I'm here to break the curse," she said. The skeletal figure nodded slowly, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The final test awaits." Before Sophia could respond, the chamber began to collapse, the walls crumbling around them. The ground beneath their feet gave way, and they fell once more, the locket's glow their only light. As they plummeted into darkness, Sophia realized the truth. The curse was far from broken, and the final test would demand everything they had. Chapter 7. The final test. The fall was shorter this time, but no less harrowing. Sophia and Adrian landed in a vast, dimly lit chamber, its walls covered in ancient, crumbling frescoes that depicted scenes of suffering and despair. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to echo from every corner. Sophia groaned as she pushed herself to her feet, her body aching from the impact. Adrian was already standing, his eyes scanning the room. "Where are we now?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Adrian shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know," he said, "but we're running out of time. The curse is accelerating." Sophia clutched the locket tightly, its cold metal biting into her palm. "What do we do now?" she asked. Adrian's gaze was steady. "We face the final test," he said. "Whatever it is, we do it together." The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows. At the far end stood a massive stone altar, its surface carved with the same symbols as the locket and the key. The air around the altar seemed to shimmer, as if the space itself was alive. Sophia felt a pull, a strange force drawing her toward it. "It's calling to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian took her hand, his grip firm. "We'll face it together," he said. As they approached the altar, the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and despair. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The locket in Sophia's hand began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening with each step. "What happens when we get there?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's expression was grim. "We'll find out," he said. "But whatever it is, we can't turn back now." The altar was massive, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as they approached. At its center was a shallow basin, filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to ripple of its own accord. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test begins." Adrian stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the basin. "This is it," he said. "The final test. We need to invoke the ritual, the one that will break the curse." Sophia's heart pounded as she held the locket. "How do we do that?" she asked. Adrian hesitated, his gaze dropping to the locket. "The key is you," he said. "You're tied to the curse, Sophia. You're the only one who can activate the ritual." Sophia's hands trembled as she held the locket, its cold metal biting into her palm. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Adrian's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "You need to offer a part of yourself," he said. "A sacrifice. The curse demands a price." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "A sacrifice?" she whispered. Adrian nodded, his expression grim. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. The air around the altar seemed to shimmer, the shadows deepening as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning, "Choose wisely." Sophia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'll do it," she said. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Adrian's hand tightened around hers. "You're not alone," he said. "We'll face this together." Sophia nodded, her heart pounding as she stepped forward. She held the locket over the basin, its glow intensifying as it neared the dark liquid. The moment the locket touched the liquid, the chamber erupted into chaos. The air was filled with a deafening roar, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. The frescoes on the walls seemed to come to life, their figures moving and screaming in silent agony. Sophia felt a searing pain in her hand, as if the locket was burning into her skin. "Hold on!" Adrian shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The pain spread through Sophia's body, a cold fire that consumed her from within. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and despair. The locket's glow intensified, its light filling the chamber with an unnatural radiance. Sophia felt herself being pulled into the basin, the dark liquid rising to meet her. As the liquid enveloped her, Sophia realized the truth. The final test was not just a trial of the body, but of the soul. The curse demanded everything: her fears, her regrets, her very essence. And as the darkness closed in around her, she knew there was no turning back. Chapter 8. The blood pact. The darkness was all-consuming, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Sophia felt herself drifting, her body weightless and numb. The air was cold, and the whispers were louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and despair. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her limbs refused to obey. The only thing she could feel was the locket, its cold metal biting into her skin, its glow faint but steady. Suddenly, she was falling, the darkness giving way to a dim, flickering light. She landed in a vast, circular chamber, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected her image infinitely. The air was thick with the scent of iron, and the ground beneath her feet was cold and damp. Adrian was nowhere to be seen. "Adrian," she called, her voice trembling. The mirrors seemed to amplify her words, her own voice echoing back at her in a haunting chorus. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and despair. The mirrors began to shift, their surfaces rippling like water. One by one, the reflections of Sophia began to change, their faces twisting into expressions of terror, rage, and sorrow. She felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test is not yet over." A figure emerged from the mirrors, her form indistinct and wavering. It was the woman, the rival. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and gaunt. She stepped forward, her tattered gown trailing behind her like shadows given form. "You thought you could break the curse," she said, her voice like a serpent's hiss. "But you are merely a pawn in a game that began long before you were born." Sophia's heart pounded as she backed away, her steps faltering. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I want what you cannot give," she said. "I want your soul." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "I won't let you take it," she said, her voice firm. The woman's laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and merciless. "You have no choice," she said. "The curse demands a sacrifice. And you, my dear, are the chosen one." The mirrors began to close in, their surfaces rippling and shifting. The reflections of Sophia began to reach out, their hands clawing at the air as if trying to escape. She felt a searing pain in her chest, as if the locket was burning into her skin. Adrian's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with urgency. "Sophia, hold on." She turned to see him standing at the edge of the chamber, his face pale but determined. "You're not alone," he said. "We'll face this together." Sophia felt a surge of hope as she reached for him, her fingers trembling. The woman's laughter faded, replaced by a cold, calculating silence. "Very well," the woman said finally. "If you wish to challenge the curse, you must prove yourselves worthy. The blood pact must be sealed." Sophia's heart pounded as she turned to Adrian. "What does she mean?" she asked. Adrian's expression was grim. "The blood pact is the final test," he said. "It's a binding agreement, a promise to accept the consequences of breaking the curse." The woman's gaze shifted to Adrian, her expression unreadable. "You have been a worthy opponent," she said. "But the curse cannot be broken without a price that you must both pay." Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "Choose wisely." Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "We'll do it," he said. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Sophia's heart pounded as she held the locket tightly. "What happens after we seal the pact?" she asked. The woman's smile twisted into a sneer. "You will see," she said. "The curse is eternal, and the blood pact is the key to its undoing." The woman raised her hand, her fingers curling into a claw. The air around her began to shimmer, the shadows deepening as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test is not yet over." As the darkness closed in around her, Sophia realized the truth. The blood pact was the final test, and the curse demanded everything they had. But as the cold breath returned, she knew there was no turning back. Chapter 9. The sacrifice. The chamber was engulfed in darkness, the air thick with the scent of iron and decay. Sophia's heart pounded as she clutched the locket tightly, its cold metal biting into her skin. The whispers had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against her from all sides. Adrian stood beside her, his face pale but determined. "What now?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. The silence was answer enough. The woman's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and merciless. "The blood pact is sealed," she said. "But the curse demands a sacrifice, a price that you must both pay." The air around her began to shimmer, the shadows deepening as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "Choose wisely." Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "We'll do it," he said. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Sophia's heart pounded as she held the locket tightly. "What happens after we seal the pact?" she asked. The woman's smile twisted into a sneer. "You will see," she said. "The curse is eternal, and the blood pact is the key to its undoing." The woman raised her hand, her fingers curling into a claw. The air around her began to shimmer, the shadows deepening as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test is not yet over." As the darkness closed in around her, Sophia realized the truth. The blood pact was the final test, and the curse demanded everything they had. But as the cold breath returned, she knew there was no turning back. The woman's laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and merciless. "You thought you could break the curse," she said. "But you are merely pawns in a game that began long before you were born." The mirrors began to shift, their surfaces rippling like water. One by one, the reflections of Sophia began to change, their faces twisting into expressions of terror, rage, and sorrow. Sophia felt a searing pain in her chest, as if the locket was burning into her skin. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her limbs refused to obey. The only thing she could feel was the locket, its cold metal biting into her skin, its glow faint but steady. Adrian's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with urgency. "Sophia, hold on." She turned to see him standing at the edge of the chamber, his face pale but determined. "You're not alone," he said. "We'll face this together." Sophia felt a surge of hope as she reached for him, her fingers trembling. The woman's gaze shifted to Adrian, her expression unreadable. "You have been a worthy opponent," she said. "But the curse cannot be broken without a price that you must both pay." Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "Choose wisely." Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "We'll do it," he said. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it." Sophia's heart pounded as she held the locket tightly. "What happens after we seal the pact?" she asked. The woman's smile twisted into a sneer. "You will see," she said. "The curse is eternal, and the blood pact is the key to its undoing." The woman raised her hand, her fingers curling into a claw. The air around her began to shimmer, the shadows deepening as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test is not yet over." As the darkness closed in around her, Sophia realized the truth. The blood pact was the final test, and the curse demanded everything they had. But as the cold breath returned, she knew there was no turning back. Chapter 10. The breaking of the curse. The darkness was suffocating, swallowing Sophia and Adrian whole. The air was cold, and the whispers had returned, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. Sophia clutched the locket tightly, its glow flickering faintly in the void. Adrian's hand found hers, his grip firm and grounding. "We're not alone," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll face this together." Sophia nodded, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her breathing. The woman's voice echoed through the void, cold and merciless. "The blood pact is sealed," she said. "But the curse demands a sacrifice, a price that you must both pay." The air around them began to shift, the darkness coalescing into a swirling vortex of shadows. Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "Choose wisely." Adrian stepped forward, shielding Sophia with his body. "What do you mean by a sacrifice?" he demanded, his voice sharp with defiance. The woman's hollow eyes gleamed with malice. "The curse thrives on pain and loss," she said. "To break it, you must offer something of equal value, something irreplaceable." Sophia's stomach churned as she realized the truth. The curse wasn't just about breaking it, it was about losing something in the process. "What are you asking of us?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. The woman's smile twisted into a sneer. "One of you must stay," she said. "One of you must remain in this void, bound to the curse forever, while the other is set free." Sophia's heart pounded as she exchanged a look with Adrian. His expression was grim, but resolute. "No," he said firmly. "There has to be another way." The woman's laughter echoed through the void, cold and merciless. "There is no other way," she said. "The curse is eternal, and its demands are absolute. You must choose, or the curse will claim you both." Sophia felt a surge of despair as she gripped Adrian's hand tighter. "I won't let you stay," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll find another way." Adrian shook his head, his gaze steady. "If it's the only way to save you, I'll do it," he said. "I'll stay." Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I can't lose you." Adrian's hand cupped her face, his touch gentle despite the chaos around them. "You're strong, Sophia," he said. "You've always been strong. You can survive this, but only if you let me go." The woman's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Time is running out," she said. "Choose now, or the curse will claim you both." Sophia felt a cold breath on her neck, the whisper returning. "The final test is not yet over." Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the locket, its glow flickering faintly in the darkness. She thought of everything she'd been through, the horrors she'd faced, the sacrifices she'd made. She thought of her family, her friends, the life she'd left behind. And she thought of Adrian, his strength, his kindness, the way he'd stood by her side through it all. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. With a surge of determination, Sophia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "No," she said. "I won't let you stay. I'll take your place instead." Adrian's eyes widened in horror. "Sophia, no!" he shouted, reaching for her. But she was already stepping into the vortex, the darkness swallowing her whole. The woman's laughter echoed through the void, cold and merciless. "You may have broken the curse," she said. "But at what cost?" The vortex began to shrink, the darkness receding as Sophia's form disappeared into the void. Adrian's heart pounded as he realized what she'd done, what she'd sacrificed to save him. As the darkness faded, the chamber around him began to shift, its walls crumbling into dust. The curse was broken, its hold on the world shattered. But the loss was unbearable. Adrian fell to his knees, his hands clutching the locket, the symbol of Sophia's sacrifice. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice trembling with determination. "I'll bring you back." The woman's voice echoed one last time, cold and distant. "The curse is broken," she said. "But some bonds cannot be undone." And as the chamber collapsed around him, Adrian knew that the fight wasn't over. The curse was broken, but the cost was too great. And he would stop at nothing to bring Sophia back. Melody of the Damned. Chapter 1. The Cursed Symphony. The Royal Symphony Hall shimmered with anticipation, its gilded balconies and velvet-draped walls glowing softly under the chandelier's warm light. Isabella Rose stood center stage, her slender fingers wrapped around the neck of her beloved Stradivarius. The audience, a sea of black-tie elegance, leaned forward in their seats, their collective breath held as she tightened her bow. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, but it was Julian Kane's presence in the conductor's stand that set her nerves on edge. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the world seemed to still. Julian's arms rose gracefully, and the orchestra followed his lead, drawing their bows across strings and exhaling into brass. The opening notes of the Symphony of Shadows spilled into the air, a mournful, lilting melody that sent shivers down Isabella's spine. It was a piece she had never heard before, something Julian had composed specifically for this performance. The music was hauntingly beautiful, each note trembling with emotion, but there was something unsettling beneath the surface, a dissonance that made her heart race. She tightened her grip on the violin and leaned into the music, letting it consume her. The first movement began softly, like a whisper in the dark, but it quickly built into a thundering crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. Isabella's bow danced across the strings, her fingers moving with a life of their own as she poured her soul into the music. The symphony was unlike anything she had ever played before. It was as if the notes themselves were alive, writhing and twisting in the air, weaving a tapestry of sound that was as intoxicating as it was unnerving. She could feel the music clawing at the edges of her mind, pulling her deeper into its embrace. As the first movement came to a close, Isabella risked a glance at Julian. He was completely absorbed in the music, his face a mask of intensity. Sweat gleamed on his brow, and his hands moved with an almost frantic energy, as though he were fighting to control the symphony rather than conducting it. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark and unreadable, but it was gone before she could be sure. The audience erupted into applause, but Isabella barely noticed. She was too focused on the strange feeling gnawing at the edges of her consciousness, a lingering unease she couldn't quite shake. The second movement began, and almost immediately, something felt off. The music shifted, the haunting melody giving way to something darker, more discordant. The lights in the hall seemed to dim, casting long shadows across the stage. Isabella's bow faltered for the briefest of moments, but she quickly recovered, forcing herself to focus on the sheet music in front of her. The symphony swelled around her, the notes twisting and writhing like a living thing. She could feel the music pressing in on her, threatening to overwhelm her, but she pushed the thought aside and played on. And then it happened. Without warning, the chandelier above the audience let out an ear-splitting groan, and the world seemed to slow as it plummeted toward the ground. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood filled the air, followed by a chorus of screams. Isabella froze, her bow hovering above the strings as she stared in horror at the wreckage below. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured, but the mood in the hall had shifted. The air was thick with tension, and the once majestic performance space now felt like a gilded cage. The orchestra fell silent, the final, discordant note of the symphony hanging in the air like a curse. Julian lowered his baton, his face pale but composed. He turned to face the audience, his expression unreadable as he offered a shallow bow. The applause was hesitant at first, but it quickly grew louder, filling the hall with a hollow echo. Isabella forced a smile and curtsied, her heart pounding in her chest. As the audience rose to their feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. After the performance, Isabella retreated to her dressing room, her hands still trembling. She set her violin carefully in its case, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. There was something about the symphony, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was as if the music had a life of its own, something dark and malevolent that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She shook her head, chiding herself for being so superstitious. It was just a coincidence, she told herself, nothing more. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Julian standing in the doorway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his tailored jacket. "You played beautifully tonight," he said, his voice smooth and melodic. "I knew you were the perfect choice for this piece." Isabella forced a smile, though her unease lingered. "Thank you. It's unlike anything I've ever played before. Where did you say you found it again?" Julian hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground for the briefest of moments. "It's an old piece," he said evasively. "I came across it in my travels. I knew it was special the moment I heard it." There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl, but she couldn't quite place it. Before she could press him further, the lights in the room flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as the air around her seemed to grow colder. For a moment, she thought she heard whispering soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. The lights returned to normal, and the room was silent once more. Chapter 2. Whispers in the music. The days that followed the incident at the Royal Symphony Hall were a blur for Isabella. She tried to push the memory of the falling chandelier to the back of her mind, but it lingered like a shadow, dark and unshakable. Julian, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He was already making plans for their next performance, his enthusiasm undiminished. Isabella couldn't understand how he could be so calm. She had seen the way his hands trembled during the symphony, the way his face had paled when the chandelier fell. And yet, here he was, acting as though nothing had happened. They met at Julian's studio, a grand, cavernous space filled with instruments of every kind. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and rosin, and the walls were lined with shelves overflowing with sheet music and ancient manuscripts. Julian stood at his desk, his fingers tracing the lines of a faded, yellowed score. "We'll perform the second movement next week," he said without looking up. "The critics loved the first piece, but this will leave them speechless." Isabella frowned, her unease growing. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" After what happened, Julian cut her off with a wave of his hand. "What happened was an accident, nothing more. The symphony is a masterpiece, Isabella. It deserves to be heard." His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. Despite her reservations, Isabella agreed to rehearse. She couldn't deny the allure of the music, the way it seemed to call to her even when she wasn't playing it. They began with the second movement, a piece that was even more haunting and complex than the first. The notes seemed to twist and writhe in the air, weaving a tapestry of sound that was both beautiful and unsettling. As Isabella played, she began to notice something strange. The music seemed to shift and change, as though it had a life of its own. The tempo grew faster, the notes sharper, until it felt as though the music was pulling her along, forcing her to play faster and louder than she ever had before. Her fingers moved across the strings with a frantic energy, her bow scraping against the wood as she struggled to keep up. And then she heard it, the whispers. They were soft at first, barely audible over the music, but they grew louder with each passing moment. They seemed to come from all around her, hissing and murmuring words she couldn't quite understand. The voices were urgent, almost pleading, as though they were trying to tell her something. She tried to ignore them, to focus on the music, but they were impossible to block out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. Her hands began to tremble, her bow slipping from her grasp. The music screeched to a halt, the sudden silence deafening. Julian lowered his baton, a look of concern on his face. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with something else, something that sounded almost like suspicion. Isabella forced a smile, though her heart was still racing. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired, I guess. Maybe we should call it a day." Julian nodded, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Of course. We'll pick this up tomorrow." Isabella packed up her violin and left the studio, the whispers still echoing in her mind. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that she was simply overworked and stressed. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The music, the whispers, the strange accidents, they were all connected, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were softer now, almost soothing, but no less unsettling. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, her heart pounding as she tried to block them out. But they were relentless, their soft murmurs filling the silence of the night. And then, just as she was about to give up and turn on the light, she heard it, a single clear word, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. Played Chapter 3. The composer's shadow. The next morning, Isabella arrived at Julian's studio early, hoping to clear her head before their rehearsal. The whispers from the night before still lingered in her mind, a persistent hum that refused to fade. She stepped into the studio, the familiar scent of aged wood and rosin greeting her, but something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the shadows seemed darker, deeper, as though they were hiding something. She shook off the feeling and set up her violin, determined to focus. Julian arrived a few minutes later, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a strange, almost feverish energy. "I've made some changes to the second movement," he said, handing her a sheet of music. "I think you'll find it more intense." The ink on the page was fresh, the notes jagged and uneven, as though they had been scribbled in haste. Isabella frowned as she scanned the sheet. The music was darker than before, the tempo marked prestissimo, faster than any piece she had ever played. They began the rehearsal, and almost immediately, Isabella felt the music's pull. The notes seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around her and dragging her into their rhythm. Her hands moved faster than she thought possible, her bow skipping across the strings as the music swirled around her. But there was something else now, something she hadn't noticed before. A shape in the corner of the room, just out of the corner of her eye, a shadow that didn't belong. She tried to focus on the music, but the shadow lingered, growing darker and more defined with each passing moment. She could feel it watching her, its presence pressing down on her like a weight. Her fingers faltered, the music screeching to a halt. Julian lowered his baton, his expression a mixture of irritation and concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice sharp. Isabella nodded, though her hands were trembling. "I thought I saw something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced toward the corner of the room, but the shadow was gone. Julian followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It's probably just the lighting," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He raised his baton again, and the music resumed, the notes even faster and more frantic than before. As the rehearsal continued, the shadow returned. It was no longer confined to the corner of the room. It moved, shifting and twisting as though it had a life of its own. Isabella tried to ignore it, to focus on the music, but it was impossible. The shadow grew bolder, creeping closer and closer until it was almost upon her. She could feel its presence, cold and menacing, and she knew without a doubt that it was watching her. The music reached its climax, the notes spiraling out of control, and the shadow seemed to surge forward, engulfing her in its darkness. Isabella's bow slipped from her grasp, the sound of it clattering to the floor echoing through the studio. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. Julian lowered his baton, his expression a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "What's wrong with you today?" he snapped, his voice harsh. "You're making mistakes you've never made before." Isabella shook her head, her voice trembling. I saw something. A shadow, in the corner of the room. It was watching me." Julian's expression softened, though his eyes remained guarded. "It's just your imagination," he said, his voice quieter now. "This piece, it's intense. It can play tricks on your mind." Isabella wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadow might have been gone, but its presence lingered, a cold, heavy weight in the air. As she packed up her violin and left the studio, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And when she turned to glance back, she swore she saw the shadow again, standing in the window, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Chapter 4. The broken strings. The night after the rehearsal, Isabella couldn't sleep. The shadow's lingering presence haunted her, its hollow eyes burned into her memory. She tossed and turned, the whispers from the music echoing in her mind. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went to her study, where her violin sat in its worn velvet case. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the polished wood. The instrument felt familiar, a comforting weight in her hands, but tonight it felt different, almost alive, as though it were calling to her. She lifted the violin to her chin and began to play, her fingers moving instinctively across the strings. The melody was soft, a gentle lullaby she had played 1,000 times before. But as the notes filled the room, they began to shift, twisting into something darker, more ominous. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices urgent and pleading. Isabella tried to stop, but her hands refused to obey. The music played her now, its notes pulling her deeper and deeper into its spell. And then, with a sharp twang, the E string snapped. The sound was deafening in the silence of the night, and Isabella jumped, her heart racing. She stared at the violin, the broken string coiled like a lifeless snake. Her hands trembled as she set the instrument down, the whispers fading into uneasy silence. She could feel it, the presence in the room, cold and watchful. She wasn't alone. The next morning, Isabella went to a small, dimly lit music shop tucked away in the city's oldest quarter. The proprietor, an elderly man with a hunched back and a pair of thick glasses, greeted her with a nod. "Ah, Miss Rose," he said, his voice raspy. "What can I do for you today?" Isabella placed the violin on the counter, her fingers brushing over the broken string. "I need a new E string," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. The man nodded and disappeared into the back of the shop, leaving her alone with the countless instruments that lined the walls. As she waited, her eyes fell on an old, dusty painting hanging above the counter. It depicted a man with wild, unkempt hair, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. In his hands was a violin, its strings frayed and broken. Beneath the painting was a nameplate, Lucian Blackthorne, 1789. She felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about the man's eyes, something familiar. The proprietor returned, a new E string in hand. "This should do," he said, placing it on the counter. Isabella hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the painting. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man followed her gaze, his expression darkening. "Lucian Blackthorne," he said, his voice heavy with unease. "He was a composer and a madman. They say his music was cursed, that it drove him to madness. He disappeared centuries ago, but his work, it never left." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "His work?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. The man shook his head, his eyes filled with a strange, ancient sorrow. "Best not to ask too many questions, Miss Rose. Some things are better left buried." Isabella paid for the string and left the shop, her mind racing. The whispers, the shadow, the broken string, it all pointed to something she couldn't ignore. When she returned home, she found Julian waiting for her on her doorstep. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. "We need to talk," he said, his voice strained. Inside, Julian paced her living room, his hands clenched into fists. "You felt it too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The music, it's alive. It's changing us." Isabella nodded, her heart pounding. "It's not just the music," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's him. Lucian Blackthorne. He's behind this." Julian stopped pacing, his face pale. "We need to uncover the truth," he said, his voice urgent. "Before it's too late." Chapter 5. The Cursed Manuscript. Julian and Isabella sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. The name Lucian Blackthorne was no longer just a name, it was a specter, a shadow that loomed over them both. Julian pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and set it on the coffee table between them. It was an aged map of the city, its edges frayed and yellowed with time. "Blackthorne's final composition was never completed," Julian explained, his voice low. "But there's a rumor that he left something behind. A manuscript." Isabella leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the map. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian's finger traced a line to a forgotten part of the city, an area swallowed by time and decay. "Here," he said, tapping the spot. "Blackthorne's old estate. If the manuscript exists, it's there." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. The idea of stepping into Blackthorne's world terrified her, but she knew they had no choice. The next evening, they found themselves standing before the crumbling gates of Blackthorne's estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless. Vines crawled up its stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Julian pushed the gates open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice tense. Inside, the mansion was a maze of shadows and dust. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the air was so cold it seemed to seep into their bones. Julian held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to resist the light, clinging stubbornly to the corners of the room. Isabella clutched her violin case tightly, as though it could protect her from the unknown. They made their way to the study, a room lined with shelves of ancient books and crumbling sheet music. The centerpiece of the room was an old ornate desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Julian stepped forward, his hands trembling as he opened the drawers. "It has to be here," he muttered, his voice filled with desperation. Isabella's eyes fell on a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the room. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though it were guarding something important. She pointed it out to Julian, who nodded and pulled a set of lockpicks from his pocket. It took him a few tries, but eventually, the lock clicked open. Inside was a weathered leather-bound manuscript, its pages yellowed and brittle. Julian lifted it carefully, his hands shaking. "This is it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Blackthorne's final work." He opened the manuscript, and Isabella gasped. The notes were jagged and chaotic, the ink faded but still legible. And there, at the top of the first page, was the title, The Symphony of Shadows. As Julian flipped through the pages, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening. Isabella could feel the presence again, cold and heavy, pressing down on her. "We shouldn't take it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not ours to take." Julian shook his head, his eyes filled with a feverish intensity. "We need this," he said. "It's the key to understanding what's happening to us." He closed the manuscript and tucked it under his arm, his expression resolute. As they left the study, the air grew colder, the whispers returning with a vengeance. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Isabella's heart raced as she followed Julian through the mansion, the shadows twisting and shifting around them. And then, just as they reached the front door, they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the halls. Isabella froze, her breath catching in her throat. Julian grabbed her arm and pulled her through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The growl faded, replaced by an eerie silence. They stood in the moonlight, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "We're safe now," Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. Isabella glanced back at the mansion, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the night sky. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something that wouldn't rest until it had claimed them both. Chapter 6. The haunting melody back at Julian's studio. They pored over the manuscript, its pages spread across the grand piano like shards of a shattered mirror. The notes were chaotic, the harmonies dissonant, and the tempo markings erratic. Julian's eyes gleamed with a mixture of fascination and unease as he traced the jagged lines with his fingers. This is unlike anything I've ever seen," he murmured, his voice hushed with reverence. Isabella stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The room felt colder than it had before, the air thick with an unspoken dread. "We shouldn't touch it," Isabella said again, her voice trembling. "We don't know what it's capable of." Julian shook his head, his expression defiant. "We need to understand it," he insisted. "It's the only way to stop whatever's happening to us." Before she could protest, he picked up his baton and began to conduct, humming the melody under his breath. The notes seemed to coil in the air, twisting and writhing like restless spirits. Isabella watched in horror as the shadows in the room began to shift, their edges sharpening into grotesque shapes. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent than ever, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. She tried to block them out, to focus on Julian, but it was impossible. The music was alive, and it was pulling them both into its dark embrace. Without warning, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the echo of Julian's humming, now distorted and otherworldly. Isabella reached for her phone, her hands fumbling as she turned on the flashlight. The beam landed on Julian, and she gasped. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unseeing, as though he were in a trance. "Julian!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the suffocating silence. He didn't respond. He continued to conduct, his movements mechanical and deliberate. Isabella grabbed his arm, trying to shake him out of it, but his skin was ice cold. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a single, deafening command. "Play." In a desperate attempt to break the spell, Isabella grabbed her violin and began to play, the notes clashing violently with Julian's melody. At first, it seemed to have no effect, but then the whispers faltered, their voices breaking into fragments. Julian's baton slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. He blinked, his eyes focusing on Isabella, and for a moment, the room was silent. What just happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Isabella lowered her violin, her hands trembling. "The music, it was controlling you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian stared at the manuscript, his expression haunted. "We need to destroy it," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "It's the only way." Isabella nodded, though she felt a pang of unease. The manuscript wasn't just paper and ink, it was something more, something alive. She watched as Julian gathered the pages and held them over the fireplace. He hesitated, his hands shaking, and then he tossed them into the flames. The fire roared to life, the manuscript curling and blackening as the flames consumed it. But then, something strange happened. The flames turned an unnatural shade of blue, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. The pages didn't burn, they screamed, their voices merging into a single piercing shriek. Julian stumbled back, his face pale with terror. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Isabella grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest. The flames died down, leaving the manuscript untouched, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. The room fell silent, the whispers fading into an uneasy stillness. Julian sank to the floor, his hands covering his face. "We can't destroy it," he whispered, his voice filled with despair. "It's too powerful." Isabella sat beside him, her mind racing. The manuscript was a curse, a living, breathing entity that refused to be silenced. And now, it had claimed them both. She glanced at Julian, his face etched with fear, and knew that they were running out of time. The Symphony of Shadows was no longer just a piece of music, it was a force, and it wouldn't rest until it had consumed them completely. Chapter 7. The phantoms grasped the days that followed the failed attempt to destroy the manuscript were a blur of unease and exhaustion. Julian and Isabella barely slept, the whispers haunting them even in their dreams. Julian insisted they continue working on the symphony, convinced they could control the music if they mastered it. Isabella, however, grew increasingly wary. The manuscript's power was undeniable, and the more they engaged with it, the deeper they sank into its grasp. Late one night, Isabella found herself alone in Julian's studio, the manuscript open on the piano. She hadn't intended to look at it, but the whispers had grown louder, their voices impossible to ignore. Her eyes fell on a passage she hadn't noticed before, a haunting melody marked Lament of the Lost. The notes seemed to call to her, their beauty almost as terrifying as their darkness. She picked up her violin, her fingers trembling as they found their place on the strings. The first note reverberated through the room, deep and mournful. As she played, the music wrapped around her, pulling her into its world. The studio faded away, replaced by a fog-shrouded landscape. She was no longer alone. In the distance, she saw a figure, a man with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. Lucian Blackthorne. He stood motionless, his violin in hand, watching her as she played. Isabella tried to stop, but the music wouldn't let her. It played her now, its melody twisting and turning as though it had a will of its own. Lucian raised his bow and began to play a counter-melody, his notes clashing violently with hers. The sound was piercing, agonizing, and yet it was impossible to stop. The fog thickened, closing in around her, and she could feel Lucian's presence, cold and unrelenting. His voice echoed in her mind, low and commanding. "You are mine now." Isabella woke with a start, her violin slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She was back in the studio, the manuscript closed on the piano. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing. She could still hear Lucian's melody in her head, its notes sharp and cutting. Julian found her moments later, his face pale with concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella shook her head, struggling to find the words. "He was here," she said at last. "Lucian Blackthorne." Julian's expression darkened, and he glanced at the manuscript as though it were a living thing. "We need to confront him," Julian said, his voice filled with resolve. "The manuscript isn't just a piece of music, it's a gateway. If we can find him, maybe we can break the curse." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. The idea of facing Lucian Blackthorne terrified her, but she knew Julian was right. They couldn't run from this. That night, they returned to Blackthorne's estate, the manuscript clutched tightly in Julian's hands. The mansion loomed in the moonlight, its windows dark and lifeless. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the whispers were louder than ever, their voices merging into a single, deafening roar. Inside, the mansion was colder than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Julian led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the shadows resisted the light, clinging stubbornly to the corners of the room. They made their way to the study, the manuscript's presence heavy in the air. Julian placed the manuscript on the desk and opened it to the page Isabella had played the Lament of the Lost. He began to conduct, his movements slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a single piercing shriek. And then Lucian Blackthorne appeared. He stood in the corner of the room, his violin in hand, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. The air grew colder, the shadows twisting and writhing around him. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Lucian smiled, his expression cold and unfeeling. "Because," he said, his voice echoing through the room, "the world must hear my symphony." Chapter 8. The symphony's price. The confrontation with Lucian left Isabella and Julian shaken, the weight of his presence lingering long after he vanished. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder, their voices more insistent, as though Lucian's symphony was tightening its grip on them. Julian became obsessed with the manuscript, spending hours hunched over the piano, his fingers trembling as he transcribed the notes. Isabella watched him with growing concern, his once vibrant eyes now hollow and haunted. "Julian, we need to stop this," she said one evening, her voice firm. "Every time we play it, we lose a little more of ourselves." Julian shook his head vehemently, his fingers still dancing across the keys. "No," he said, his voice strained. "We're so close to understanding it. If we can just finish the symphony, we can control it, don't you see?" Isabella didn't see. All she saw was the toll the music was taking on him, the way his hands shook and his skin took on a sickly pallor. That night, Isabella had another dream. She stood on a darkened stage, her violin in hand, surrounded by an audience of shadows. Lucian stood at the conductor's podium, his baton raised, his eyes locked on hers. The music began, a cacophony of sound that tore through her soul. She tried to stop, but her hands wouldn't obey. The audience leaned forward, their hollow eyes watching as the music consumed her. She woke in a cold sweat, the echoes of the symphony still ringing in her ears. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. She grabbed her violin and went to Julian's studio, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was ajar, and the sound of frantic playing reached her ears. She pushed the door open and froze. Julian sat at the piano, his back to her, his fingers moving furiously across the keys. The manuscript was open before him, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard, twisted, dissonant, and utterly consuming. The shadows in the room writhed and twisted, their edges sharpening into grotesque shapes. "Julian, stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. He didn't respond. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his movements mechanical. Isabella ran to him, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him, but he didn't flinch. The music grew louder, the whispers merging into a deafening roar. Desperate, Isabella grabbed her violin and began to play, her notes clashing violently with Julian's. At first, it seemed to have no effect, but then the music faltered, the whispers breaking into fragments. Julian's hands stilled, and he blinked, his gaze focusing on her. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Before she could respond, the manuscript's pages began to flutter, the notes lifting off the page and swirling in the air. The shadows deepened, their edges sharpening into grotesque shapes. And then Lucian appeared. He stood in the corner of the room, his violin in hand, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. The air grew colder, the shadows twisting and writhing around him. "You cannot escape me," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "The symphony must be completed. Isabella stepped in front of Julian, her violin raised like a weapon. "You won't take him," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Lucian smiled, his expression cold and unfeeling. "Oh, my dear," he said, "I already have." The music began again, its notes sharp and cutting. Julian's hands moved to the keys, his eyes glazed over. Isabella tried to stop him, but the shadows held her back, their cold tendrils wrapping around her arms. She watched in horror as Julian played, his movements mechanical and deliberate. And then, with a final piercing note, the manuscript burst into flames, its pages curling and blackening. Julian slumped forward, his hands falling from the keys. The shadows dissipated, the whispers fading into an uneasy silence. Isabella ran to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Julian," she shouted, her voice breaking. He didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his face pale and lifeless. The symphony had claimed its price. Chapter 9. The final note. Julian's collapse left Isabella in a state of panic. She knelt beside him, shaking him gently, but he remained unresponsive, his breathing shallow and uneven. The studio was eerily silent, the whispers gone for the first time in weeks. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. The manuscript was gone, reduced to ashes, but Lucian's presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight in the air. She managed to drag Julian to the couch, covering him with a blanket as she frantically searched for her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed for help, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flickered, static distorting the image before it went dark. Isabella cursed under her breath, her heart pounding. She was trapped, and Julian's fate rested in her hands. A faint sound reached her ears, a melody, soft and haunting. Isabella froze, her blood running cold. She knew that melody. It was the lament of the lost, the piece she had played in her dream. The notes drifted through the studio, their source impossible to locate. Isabella's eyes darted around the room, but she was alone, or so it seemed. The music grew louder, its notes sharp and cutting, and Isabella felt a familiar pull, an irresistible urge to play. Her violin lay on the floor where she had dropped it, its strings glinting in the dim light. She reached for it hesitantly, her fingers brushing the polished wood. The moment she touched it, the music overwhelmed her, filling her mind with its dark, consuming melody. She raised the violin to her shoulder, the bow trembling in her hand. The first note echoed through the studio, deep and mournful. As she played, the room seemed to dissolve, replaced by the same fog-shrouded landscape she had seen in her dream. Lucian stood before her, his violin in hand, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "You cannot escape the symphony," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It is part of you now." Isabella continued to play, her movements guided by an unseen force. The music entwined with Lucian's, their melodies clashing violently. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. "Let him go," Isabella demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. Lucian smiled, his expression cold and unfeeling. "Your sacrifice will complete the symphony," he said. "The world will finally hear my masterpiece." Isabella's heart pounded as she realized what he meant. She had to play to finish the symphony, but the cost would be her life. Desperation fueled her movements as she poured her soul into the music, her notes sharp and cutting. The room dissolved further, the fog closing in around them. Lucian's playing grew more frenzied, his melody twisting and writhing as though it had a will of its own. The shadows deepened, their edges sharpening into grotesque shapes. Isabella's hands began to ache, the strain of playing evident in every note. She could feel the symphony's power, its dark, consuming energy pulling her deeper into its grasp. But she refused to give in. She focused on Julian, on the hope that he might survive if she could just defy Lucian long enough. The music reached its crescendo, the notes clashing violently in a cacophony of sound. Isabella's vision blurred, her strength waning, but she played on. The shadows twisted and writhed, their forms dissolving into the fog. Lucien's melody faltered, his playing growing erratic. With a final, piercing note, the music stopped, the silence deafening. Isabella lowered her violin, her hands trembling. Lucien stood before her, his expression one of shock and disbelief. You defy me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Isabella could respond, Lucien began to fade, his form dissolving into the fog. The landscape around her shifted, the studio materializing once more. Julian stirred on the couch, his eyes fluttering open. Isabella dropped her violin, rushing to his side. "Julian," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. He looked at her, his gaze weak but focused. "Is it over?" he asked. Isabella hesitated. She didn't know. The symphony was gone, but its echoes lingered, a haunting reminder of the price they had paid. Chapter 10. Echoes of the symphony. The days following Lucien's vanishing were a blur for Isabella and Julian. Though the symphony was gone, its echoes lingered, a faint but persistent presence in their lives. Julian's recovery was slow, his strength sapped by the ordeal. He rarely spoke of what he remembered, his eyes distant whenever Isabella brought it up. She didn't press him. She knew all too well the weight of what they had endured. Isabella returned to her violin, but the music felt different now, hollow, as though something essential had been stripped away. Every note she played seemed to carry a trace of the symphony's darkness, a reminder of the price they had paid. She tried to shake it off, to focus on the beauty of the music, but the whispers lingered in the back of her mind, their voices soft but insistent. Julian's studio remained untouched, the piano silent and gathering dust. They avoided the room, as though entering it might reawaken the horrors they had faced. But one evening, driven by a restless curiosity, Isabella found herself standing in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was still, the shadows deep and unyielding. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The piano loomed in the center of the room, its keys gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Isabella's eyes fell on the spot where the manuscript had burned, the ashes long since swept away. She knelt, her fingers brushing the floor, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint, haunting melody. Julian found her there, his expression one of concern. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's not over," she whispered. "I can still feel it." Julian shook his head, his face pale. "We can't let it control us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Together, they sat at the piano, their hands resting on the keys. The silence was heavy, the tension palpable. Julian began to play, his movements slow and deliberate. The notes were soft, tentative, but they filled the room with a sense of hope. Isabella listened, her heart aching with the beauty of the music. But then, something changed. The melody shifted, the notes growing darker, more dissonant. Julian's hands faltered, his eyes wide with fear. "It's still here," he whispered, his voice trembling. Isabella grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "We have to fight it," she said, her voice filled with resolve. They played together, their melodies clashing violently with the symphony's echoes. The music grew louder, its power overwhelming, but they refused to back down. The shadows deepened, their edges sharpening into grotesque shapes. And then, with a final piercing note, the music stopped. The room fell silent, the shadows dissipating into the dim light. Julian slumped forward, his hands falling from the keys. Isabella gripped his shoulder, her heart pounding. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Julian looked at her, his gaze weak but focused. "It's over," he said, his voice barely audible. In the weeks that followed, they worked to rebuild their lives, the horrors of the symphony fading into memory. Julian returned to conducting, his music filled with a newfound passion. Isabella's violin sang with the beauty of her soul, the echoes of the symphony banished at last. But the whispers never truly left. In quiet moments, when the world was still, Isabella would hear a faint, haunting melody, its notes soft but insistent. She would close her eyes, her heart aching with the memory of the symphony's darkness. And though the world moved on, unchanged and unaware, Isabella and Julian would always carry the echoes of the symphony within them, a reminder of the power of music, and the darkness it could unleash. Canvas of Shadows. Chapter 1. The unveiling. The gallery was alive with the hum of chatter and clinking glasses, but Lila Sinclair felt as though she were standing in a tomb. Her latest masterpiece, Portrait of the Forgotten, hung on the wall like a gaping wound, its dark hues and haunting detail drawing whispers from the crowd. The woman in the painting, a figure with hollow eyes and a ghostly smile, seemed to radiate an aura of unease. Lila had spent months perfecting every brushstroke, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. Now, as the crowd gathered around the portrait, she felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Aidan Hart, the gallery owner, stood beside her, his sharp features illuminated by the spotlight. He was a striking man, tall and confident, with a demeanor that exuded charm and authority. When he had first seen Lila's work, he had been captivated by its raw emotion and dark beauty. Now, as he gazed at the portrait, his expression was unreadable. "It's unsettling," he admitted, his voice low. "But that's what makes it extraordinary." Lila forced a smile, but her stomach churned. The woman in the painting had appeared in her dreams for weeks, demanding to be brought to life. Lila had tried to resist, but the visions had grown more vivid, more insistent. She would wake in the middle of the night, her hands trembling, as if they had been moving on their own. And now, as she stood before the portrait, she felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into her soul, as if she were alive, watching, waiting. The crowd murmured amongst themselves, their voices a blend of admiration and discomfort. "It's like she's staring right at you," someone whispered. "I've never seen anything like it," another added. Lila scanned the room, noting the way people shifted uneasily beneath the painting's gaze. She had always prided herself on her ability to evoke emotion, but this was different. This felt dangerous. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the gallery grew heavier. The air seemed to thicken, and the whispers became sharper, more urgent. Lila caught snatches of conversation, words like eerie, haunting, alive. She tried to laugh it off, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Aidan, ever the gracious host, moved through the crowd with ease, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lila's work is a testament to the power of art," he declared, raising a glass. "It challenges us, unsettles us, forces us to confront the shadows within ourselves." The crowd applauded, but their smiles were strained. Lila felt a pang of guilt, as if she had unleashed something she couldn't control. As the night drew to a close, the gallery began to empty. Lila lingered by the portrait, her fingers brushing against the frame. She felt a strange pull, as if the painting were calling to her, drawing her in. The woman's face seemed to shift in the dim light, her lips curling into a faint smile. Lila blinked, shaken, and took a step back. "It's just the lighting," she muttered to herself. "It's just the lighting." Aidan approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You've outdone yourself," he said, his voice soft. "This piece, it's going to change everything." Lila nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She had felt it the moment she finished the painting, a presence, a weight, something that didn't belong. She had tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just exhaustion, but now she wasn't so sure. As they walked through the empty gallery, the silence pressed in around them. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch them pass, their eyes following their every move. Lila shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aidan frowned. "Feel what?" He didn't notice the way the shadows shifted, stretching toward them like grasping hands. When they reached the entrance, Lila hesitated. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. "Aidan," she said, her voice trembling, What if I've done something wrong? He turned to her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? She opened her mouth to reply, but stopped herself. How could she explain the dreams, the voices, the feeling that the painting wasn't hers at all? Instead, she forced a smile and shook her head. Nothing. I'm just tired. Aiden nodded, but his eyes lingered on her face, searching for something she couldn't or wouldn't reveal. Get some rest, he said finally. You've earned it. Lila nodded, but as she stepped out into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that rest was the last thing she would find. Back in the gallery, the light above the portrait flickered and dimmed. The woman in the painting smiled, her eyes gleaming with a malice that hadn't been there before. A faint whisper echoed through the empty room, so soft it might have been the wind. Thank you. But there was no one left to hear it. Chapter 2. The woman in the painting. Aiden couldn't tear his eyes away from the portrait. The woman's gaze seemed to follow him, no matter where he stood in the gallery. Her expression was serene, almost mocking, as if she knew something he didn't. He had spent years curating art, but he had never felt so unnerved by a piece. It wasn't just the realism, the way the light caught her skin, the intricate details of her dress. It was something deeper, something almost alive. Late one evening, long after the gallery had closed, Aiden found himself standing before the painting. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lights. He stared into the woman's eyes, trying to understand what made them so unsettling. They were dark, almost black, but there was a flicker of something, anger, hunger, he couldn't tell. He reached out to touch the canvas but stopped himself. It felt too real, too wrong. The portrait had been on display for a week, and it had already become the gallery's most talked about piece. Critics praised Lila's skill, but there was an undercurrent of unease in their reviews. Hauntingly beautiful, one wrote. A masterpiece that lingers long after you've looked away, said another. Aiden didn't mention the whispers he had heard in the gallery late at night, voices that seemed to come from the painting itself. Lila, too, seemed changed. When Aiden called her to discuss the painting's success, her voice was distant, distracted. I'm glad people like it, she said, but there was no joy in her tone. She had stopped answering his texts, and when they did speak, she seemed to avoid the subject of the portrait altogether. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something dark. One night, Aiden was working late in his office when he heard a noise from the gallery. It was faint, like the rustling of fabric, but it sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the darkened room, the beam of light cutting through the shadows. The portrait hung in the center of the wall, the woman's face pale and lifeless. Aiden moved closer, his heart pounding. He could have sworn her expression had changed. As he stood before the painting, the room grew colder. The woman's eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, her lips curling into a faint smile. Aiden stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. This is insane, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. But when he looked again, the painting was as it had always been. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew better. The next morning, Aiden arrived at the gallery to find the painting surrounded by a crowd of visitors. They were whispering, pointing, their faces pale with fear. Did you see it? One woman asked. Her eyes, they moved. Aiden's stomach dropped. He tried to reassure the crowd, to tell them it was just a trick of the light, but his words rang hollow. That afternoon, Aiden called Lila. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm. She hesitated before agreeing to meet him at a quiet cafe near her studio. When she arrived, she looked pale and exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Aiden got straight to the point. There's something wrong with the painting, he said. Lila's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. I've noticed it too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like she's alive. Aiden leaned forward, his heart racing. What do you mean? Lila hesitated before continuing. Ever since I finished it, I've felt her watching me. In my dreams, in my studio. It's like she's here with me." Her hands trembled as she spoke, and Aiden reached out to steady them. They spent hours talking, piecing together what little they knew. Lila confessed that the woman in the painting wasn't entirely her creation. She had appeared in her dreams, demanding to be brought to life. "I thought it was just inspiration," Lila said, tears welling in her eyes. "But now, I don't know what I've done." Aiden's mind was racing. He had always believed in the power of art, but this was something else, something supernatural. "We need to find out more," he said. "About the woman, about the painting. There has to be an explanation." Lila nodded, but her expression was grim. She knew, as he did, that some secrets were better left buried. That night, as Aiden lay in bed, he dreamed of the woman in the painting. She stood before him, her eyes burning with a cold, relentless fire. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. Aiden woke with a start, his heart pounding. The room was empty, but the scent of oil paint lingered in the air. Chapter 3. The Shadows Cry. Lila's studio was a mess of canvases, paintbrushes, and half-finished sketches. She hadn't slept in days, her nights haunted by the woman in the painting. The voice, a soft, insistent whisper, had started a week ago, urging her to create darker, more macabre scenes. At first, she had tried to ignore it, to focus on lighter subjects, but the voice only grew louder, more demanding. "Paint," it would say, over and over, until she gave in. The latest work was almost finished, a twisted, Gothic landscape bathed in shadows. Lila didn't remember starting it, but it had come to life under her hands almost effortlessly. The figures in the painting were distorted, their faces twisted in agony, and the colors were darker than anything she had ever used. She stepped back, her heart racing. It wasn't her style. It wasn't her at all. The voice laughed softly, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Beautiful," it whispered. "Just as I imagined." Lila spun around, but the studio was empty. The air was thick with the scent of oil paint and something else, something metallic, like blood. She rubbed her hands together, trying to dispel the unease, but it clung to her like a second skin. Aiden called her that afternoon, his voice tense. "People are getting scared," he said. "The painting, it's doing things." Lila's stomach churned. She hadn't been to the gallery since the unveiling, but she had heard the rumors. Visitors claimed the woman's eyes moved, her expression changed, and some even swore they heard her whispering. "What are we going to do?" Aiden asked, his voice strained. Lila didn't have an answer. She had tried to destroy the painting twice, but each time, she found herself paralyzed, unable to lift a hand against it. The voice would grow louder, more insistent, until she gave up. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I'm afraid of what might happen if we don't do something." That night, the voice returned, louder than ever. "You were chosen," it said, its tone almost gleeful. "Don't fight it." Lila sat at her easel, her hands moving almost mechanically. The new painting was even darker than the last, a portrait of a man with hollow eyes and a gaping wound in his chest. She didn't recognize him, but she knew, deep down, that he was real. The next morning, Aiden arrived at her studio unannounced. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "I've been having dreams," he said, his voice shaking. "About the woman in the painting. She's in my house. I can feel her watching me." Lila stared at him, her heart pounding. She hadn't told him about the voice, about the new paintings, but now she knew she had to. They sat together in silence as she explained everything: the voice, the paintings, the feeling of being controlled. Aiden listened, his expression growing darker with each word. "I think it's cursed," he said finally. "The painting, the woman. It's feeding on us." Lila nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to stop it," she whispered. That afternoon, they began researching the painting, scouring old records and art history books for any clue about its origins. It wasn't until late that night that they found a faded article about an 18th century artist who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Ilara Voss, and her work was said to be cursed. She used blood in her paintings, Aiden read, his voice trembling. They say she summoned something dark. Lila's hands shook as she stared at the article. The resemblance between Portrait of the Forgotten and Ilara's work was uncanny. "Do you think it's her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aiden didn't answer, but his expression said it all. The woman in the painting wasn't just a figment of Lila's imagination, she was real, and she had chosen them for a reason. The voice returned that night, its tone almost mocking. "You're getting closer," it said. "But you'll never understand." Lila sat at her easel, her hands trembling as she painted yet another macabre scene. The figures in the painting seemed to writhe and twist, their faces contorted in silent screams. She wanted to stop, to run, but the voice held her in place, its grip unyielding. As the painting came to life, the air in the studio grew colder, the shadows deepening around her. Lila felt a presence behind her, something cold and malevolent. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel it, a hand on her shoulder, a breath on her neck. "You're mine now," the voice whispered, "and you'll never be free." Chapter 4. The summoning. The storm outside Lila's studio mirrored the turmoil within her. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. The studio was dimly lit, the flickering bulb casting long shadows across the walls. Lila stared at the latest painting, a chaotic swirl of black and crimson that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She didn't remember painting it, but there it was, staring back at her with a malevolence that made her skin crawl. Aiden's arrival was a welcome distraction. He burst through the door, soaked from the rain, his face pale and drawn. "We need to do something," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The painting, it's spreading. People are starting to notice." Lila nodded, her hands trembling. She knew he was right, but she didn't know where to begin. They spent hours poring over the article about Ilara Voss, searching for any clue that might help them break the curse. The details were sparse and unnerving. Ilara had been a reclusive artist in the 18th century, known for her disturbing works. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of horror. "It says here that she believed in the power of blood," Aiden read, his voice tense. "She used it in her paintings to summon something that could bring her art to life." Lila's stomach churned. She remembered the metallic scent in her studio, the way her hands had stained red after each painting session. She had always dismissed it as paint, but now she wasn't so sure. "Do you think I've been doing the same thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aiden didn't answer, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. That night, the voice returned, its tone mocking and cruel. "You're mine now," it whispered. "You cannot escape what you have unleashed." Lila tried to block it out, to focus on the research, but the voice was relentless. It crept into her thoughts, twisting them, turning them dark. She felt a pull toward the canvas, an urge to paint that she couldn't resist. By morning, the studio was filled with new paintings, dark, twisted scenes that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Lila didn't remember creating them, but her hands were stained, her brushes caked with dried paint. Aiden found her slumped in a corner, her face pale and drawn. "We need to destroy it," he said, his voice firm. "The painting, the studio. All of it." They gathered everything they could find, paintings, sketches, even the brushes, and piled them in the center of the room. Aiden doused the pile with lighter fluid, his hands shaking. "This is the only way," he said, his voice grim. Lila nodded, but as they lit the match, something stopped them. The voice roared to life, filling the room with a deafening scream. "You dare defy me?" it thundered. The painting leaped from the wall, its frame cracking as it landed on the floor. The woman's face twisted in fury, her eyes burning with an otherworldly light. Lila and Aiden backed away, their hearts pounding. "She's alive," Aiden whispered, his voice trembling. The studio grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. Shadows stretched toward them, wrapping around their legs like tendrils. Lila felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and unyielding, and she screamed. The voice laughed, a sound that echoed in her mind. "You cannot destroy me," it said. "I am your creation, and you are mine." Desperation took hold. Aiden grabbed a heavy palette knife and lunged at the painting, slashing at the canvas. The woman's face twisted in agony, and a piercing shriek filled the room. But as the knife cut through the fabric, the wound seemed to heal itself, the fibers knitting back together. "It's no use," Lila cried, tears streaming down her face. The voice grew louder, its tone triumphant. "You cannot win," it said. "But perhaps we can make a deal." Lila and Aiden exchanged a glance, their fear mingling with a glimmer of hope. "What do you want?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The woman's face softened, her expression almost kind. "Freedom," she said. "A vessel to walk this world once more." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Lila's mind raced as she tried to process the offer. Could they really trust her? And if they refused, what would happen? The woman's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light, and Lila knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Chapter 5. The bargain. The silence in the studio was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the flickering light bulb. Lila and Aiden stood frozen, their eyes locked on the painting. The woman's face was calm now, her expression almost inviting, but her eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light. "Freedom," she repeated, her voice soft yet commanding. "A vessel, and I will leave you in peace." Lila's mind raced. A vessel? What did that mean? She glanced at Aiden, whose face was pale and drawn. They had no weapons, no way to fight, and the painting's power seemed endless. "What kind of vessel?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The woman smiled faintly. "A body," she said. "A living, breathing form to inhabit." Aiden stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You think we're just going to hand over someone's life to you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. The woman's smile widened, her expression almost amused. "Not someone," she said. "Just you." Her eyes locked on Aiden, and he stumbled back, his face draining of color. "No," Lila cried, stepping between Aiden and the painting. "You can't have him." The woman's smile faded, her expression darkening. "Then you," she said, her gaze shifting to Lila. "Or him. Choose." Lila's heart pounded as she looked between Aiden and the painting. This wasn't a choice, it was a trap. The voice in her head returned, softer now, almost soothing. "You don't have to do this," it whispered. "There's another way." Lila frowned, her mind racing. What other way? Before she could ask, the woman in the painting spoke again. "Time is running out," she said. "Choose, or I will take both of you." Aiden grabbed Lila's arm, his grip tight. "We're not going to let her win," he said, his voice firm. But Lila could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation. They were out of options, and the painting's power was growing. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, closing in around them like a suffocating blanket. "What if we destroy you?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The woman laughed, a sound that sent chills down Lila's spine. "You've tried," she said, her tone mocking. "And yet, here I am." The room grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Lila felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and unyielding, and she screamed. Desperation took hold. "Fine," Lila cried, her voice breaking. "I'll do it. I'll be your vessel." The woman's smile returned, her expression triumphant. "A wise choice," she said. "But know this, once the bond is formed, it cannot be broken." Lila nodded, her heart pounding. She had no other choice. Aiden grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. Lila, no, he cried. We'll find another way. You can't do this. Lila shook her head, tears streaming down her face. There is no other way, she said, her voice hollow. If I don't do this, she'll take you. I can't let that happen. The woman's face softened, her expression almost kind. You are brave, she said, but foolish. The bond will be eternal. Lila took a deep breath, steeling herself. Do it, she said, her voice firm. The woman nodded, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. The room seemed to shift, the shadows twisting and writhing around them. Lila felt a cold, searing pain in her chest, as if something were tearing her apart from the inside. She screamed, her hands clutching at her chest as the woman's face loomed before her, her eyes burning with a terrible light. And then, silence. Lila collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. The pain was gone, but she felt different, cold, empty. She looked up to see Aiden staring at her, his face pale with horror. Lila, he whispered, his voice trembling. She opened her mouth to reply, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. She's gone, it said, a cruel smile spreading across her face. And now I am free. Chapter 6. The Possession. Aiden stumbled back, his heart pounding as he stared at Lila. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were now cold and calculating, a cruel smile playing on her lips. The voice that came from her mouth wasn't hers. It was deeper, darker, and filled with malice. Lila, he whispered again, his voice trembling. What have you done? The thing that had taken over Lila's body laughed, a sound that sent chills down Aiden's spine. She made a deal, it said, tilting its head as if savoring the moment. A foolish, desperate deal. And now I am free. Aiden clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had to do something. But what? The studio felt different now, colder, darker, the air heavy with an oppressive energy. The paintings on the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent life, their twisted figures writhing in the dim light. Aiden took a step forward, his voice firm despite his fear. Get out of her, he demanded. She didn't know what she was agreeing to. The thing in Lila's body smirked, its gaze flickering over him with amusement. Oh, she knew, it said, its tone mocking. She knew the price of freedom. And now she is mine. It stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnatural, as if it were still learning to control Lila's limbs. Aiden's mind raced. He couldn't fight it, that much was clear. The painting had been immune to destruction, and now its spirit had taken hold of Lila. He needed a plan, something to buy time. What do you want? He asked, his voice steady. You have your vessel. Why don't you just leave? The thing paused, its expression thoughtful. Leave? It repeated, as if the word amused it. No, I think I'll stay. This world is so intriguing. And you, Aiden, are far more interesting than I expected. Its gaze was unnerving, as if it could see into his soul. Aiden felt a surge of desperation. He had to find a way to reach Lila, to bring her back. Lila, if you're still in there, fight it, he cried, his voice echoing in the studio. The thing laughed again, a sound that was both mocking and cruel. She's gone, it said. But don't worry. I'll take good care of her body. Before Aiden could react, it lunged at him, its movements unnervingly fast. He barely managed to dodge, stumbling back into a table that toppled over, scattering brushes and paint across the floor. The thing turned to face him, its smile widening. Run, it said, its voice filled with dark amusement. It will be more fun that way. Aiden didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, his heart pounding as he heard the thing's laughter echoing behind him. The storm outside had worsened, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the streets. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't stay. As he ran, his mind raced. He needed help, expertise, knowledge, something to fight the supernatural force that had taken hold of Lila. He remembered the article about Ilara Voss, the cursed artist who had vanished centuries ago. If this was her spirit, there had to be a way to banish it. He ducked into a nearby cafe, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. The article had mentioned a historian specializing in occult art, someone who might know how to break the curse. Aiden's fingers fumbled as he typed, searching for the man's contact information. Time was running out, and he could feel the spirit closing in. As the call connected, Aiden glanced out the window, his heart sinking. The figure of Lila, or what used to be Lila, stood across the street, staring at him with cold, unyielding eyes. The historian's voice came through the phone, calm and steady, but Aiden barely heard it. "Help me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, before it's too late." Chapter 7. The historian, Dr. Elias Graves, lived on the outskirts of the city in a sprawling ivy-covered mansion that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. Aiden arrived just as the sun was setting, the storm still raging overhead. He barely remembered the drive, his mind consumed with thoughts of Lila and the thing that had taken her. Dr. Graves greeted him at the door, his expression calm but curious. He was an older man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through Aiden's facade. "You're the one who called about Ilara Voss," he said, his voice steady. "Come in. We have much to discuss." The interior of the mansion was cluttered with books, artifacts, and strange, unsettling paintings. Aiden felt a shiver run down his spine as he followed Dr. Graves into a dimly lit study. "Tell me everything," the historian said, gesturing for Aiden to sit. "Leave nothing out." Aiden hesitated, unsure where to begin. But as he started to speak, the words poured out in a frantic rush. He told Dr. Graves about Lila, the painting, the voice, the possession, everything. The historian listened in silence, his expression growing graver with each detail. When Aiden finished, Dr. Graves leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Ilara Voss," he said, his voice low. "A dangerous woman, even in death. Her work was never just art. It was a means of summoning, of binding souls to this world." He stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a thick, ancient tome. "Her curse is complex," he continued, flipping through the pages. "She bound her spirit to her paintings, ensuring her survival long after her physical death. But to truly free herself, she needs a vessel, a living body to inhabit." He turned to look at Aiden, his gaze intense. "Your friend is in grave danger." Aiden's heart sank. "Is there any way to save her?" he asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Graves hesitated, his expression grim. "It's possible," he said, "but it won't be easy. We'll need to perform a ritual, one that will sever the bond between Ilara and your friend's body. But it will require precise timing and immense focus." Aiden nodded, his determination hardening. "Tell me what to do," he said. Dr. Graves studied him for a moment, then nodded. "First, we'll need to retrieve the painting, the original vessel of Ilara's spirit. Without it, the ritual won't work." He closed the book and handed it to Aiden. "Read this. It will prepare you for what's to come." As Aiden flipped through the pages, his mind raced. The book was filled with diagrams, incantations, and warnings in a language he didn't recognize. He felt a surge of unease. This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. But he couldn't back down now, not when Lila's life was at stake. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Dr. Graves stood and walked to a cabinet, retrieving a bundle of herbs, a small vial of dark liquid, and a silver dagger. "These will help," he said, placing the items on the table. "But remember, Aiden, this isn't just a battle against Ilara. It's a battle against fear itself." Aiden took a deep breath, steeling himself. "When do we leave?" he asked. Dr. Graves glanced at the clock, his expression solemn. "Now," he said, "before it's too late." The two men gathered their supplies and stepped out into the storm, the wind and rain lashing at them as they made their way to the car. As they drove, Aiden couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him. He glanced at the historian, who was focused on the road, his expression unreadable. "What happens if we fail?" Aiden asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Dr. Graves didn't look at him. "Then we'll all be lost," he said quietly. Chapter 8. The ritual. The drive to the studio was tense and silent, the storm raging around them like a living thing. Aiden clutched the book Dr. Graves had given him, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. The historian had been quiet since they left the mansion, his focus unwavering as he navigated the flooded streets. When they arrived, the studio looked even more foreboding than before. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Aiden hesitated, his heart pounding. "What if she's waiting for us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Graves placed a hand on his shoulder. "She will be," he said, "but we're prepared." They stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of paint and decay. The paintings on the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, their dark figures twisting and writhing in the dim light. Aiden's eyes darted around the room, searching for Lila or the thing that had taken her. "Stay close," Dr. Graves instructed, his voice steady. He set down the bundle of herbs and the vial of dark liquid, then began drawing a circle on the floor with a piece of chalk. Aiden watched, his heart racing. The circle was intricate, filled with symbols he didn't recognize, but that felt heavy with meaning. "We'll need the painting," Dr. Graves said, his eyes never leaving his work. Aiden nodded and hurried to the wall where the cursed painting had hung. It was gone, the space empty and unsettling. His stomach dropped. "It's not here," he said, panic creeping into his voice. Dr. Graves paused, his expression grim. "It must be close," he said. "Ilara's spirit is bound to it. She wouldn't have gone far." Aiden's mind raced as he searched the studio, his heart pounding with every step. Then he saw it, the painting leaning against the wall in a shadowed corner, its surface gleaming in the dim light. As he approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft and mocking. "You cannot win," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. Aiden ignored it, grabbing the painting and carrying it back to Dr. Graves. The historian nodded and placed it in the center of the circle, its malevolent energy palpable. "We'll need to bind her spirit to the painting once more," Dr. Graves explained, his hands moving with precision as he arranged the herbs and the vial. "But the ritual requires focus. Any interruption could doom us all." Aiden nodded, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The historian began the incantation, his voice low and rhythmic. The air seemed to shift, the room growing colder still. Aiden watched, his heart pounding as the symbols in the circle began to glow with an eerie light. The painting trembled, the woman's face contorting in anger. "No!" the voice roared, filling the room with a deafening sound. The shadows twisted and writhed, closing in around them. Aiden felt a hand on his shoulder, cold and unyielding, and he spun around to see Lila, or what used to be Lila, standing behind him. Her eyes burned with an otherworldly light. "You dare defy me?" it hissed, its voice laced with fury. Aiden stumbled back, his mind racing. "Lila, fight it!" he cried, his voice breaking. The thing in Lila's body laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "She's gone," it said, its tone mocking. "And soon, you will be too." Dr. Graves' voice rose, the incantation reaching its climax. The symbols in the circle blazed with light, and the painting began to shake violently. The thing in Lila's body screamed, its form flickering as if it were being pulled apart. "Now!" Dr. Graves shouted. "Break the bond." Chapter 9. The breaking. The room erupted into chaos. The symbols in the circle glowed with blinding intensity, and the painting thrashed violently, as if trying to escape its confines. The thing in Lila's body, Ilara's spirit, let out a guttural scream, its form flickering between Lila's face and the twisted visage of the woman from the painting. Aiden stumbled back, his heart pounding as he tried to process what was happening. "The vial!" Dr. Graves shouted, his voice strained as he fought to maintain the incantation. "Sprinkle it around the circle now." Aiden fumbled with the small bottle, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He uncorked it and began pouring the dark liquid around the chalk circle, the scent sharp and acrid. Ilara's spirit roared, its voice echoing through the studio like a thunderclap. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and lashing out at Aiden and Dr. Graves. One caught Aiden's arm, its icy grip burning his skin. He yelped and pulled away, the vial slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. "Aiden, focus!" Dr. Graves barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "She's trying to distract us. Keep going." Aiden nodded, gritting his teeth as he reached for another vial from the historian's bag. He felt the presence of Ilara's spirit closing in, its malevolent energy pressing down on him like a physical weight. The painting was shaking so violently now that it seemed to defy gravity, hovering an inch above the ground. The face of the woman Ilara was twisted in fury, her eyes glowing with a cold, unearthly light. "You cannot defeat me," she shrieked, her voice echoing in Aiden's mind as much as in the room. Aiden finished pouring the liquid, his hands trembling but steady enough to complete the task. The circle was now complete, the symbols glowing brighter than ever. Dr. Graves' voice rose, the incantation reaching a fever pitch. The air around them crackled with energy, the storm outside seeming to echo the chaos within. Ilara's spirit lunged at Dr. Graves, her form flickering like a broken hologram. Aiden acted on instinct, stepping between them and shoving her back with all his strength. The impact felt wrong, like pushing through water, but it gave Dr. Graves the moment he needed to continue the ritual. "Lila, fight her!" Aiden shouted, desperation in his voice. "I know you're still in there. Don't let her win." The thing in Lila's body paused, its face contorting as if in pain. For a moment, Aiden saw Lila's eyes, her real eyes filled with fear and determination. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." The moment was fleeting. Ilara's spirit regained control, her face twisting back into a mask of fury. "She's mine," it screamed, its voice shaking the walls. "And now, you will both die." Aiden felt a surge of panic but also resolve. He couldn't let this happen. Not now. Dr. Graves' voice reached a crescendo, the incantation building to its climax. The symbols in the circle blazed with light, and the painting began to crack, black smoke pouring from its surface. Ilara's spirit screamed, her form flickering wildly as if being torn apart. "Now, Aiden," Dr. Graves shouted. "Break the bond." Aiden hesitated, his mind racing. How? He had no weapon, no tool to sever the connection. Then he remembered the silver dagger in Dr. Graves' bag. He snatched it up, his hands trembling as he approached the circle. The painting was shaking violently now, the black smoke forming into the shape of Ilara's face. "You cannot win," it shrieked, its voice filled with desperation. Aiden took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the dagger. "Yes, I can," he said, his voice steady. And with that, he plunged the blade into the heart of the painting. Chapter 10. The final stand. The moment the dagger pierced the painting, the room was engulfed in blinding light. Aiden staggered back, shielding his eyes as the air around him crackled with energy. The symbols in the circle flared brighter than ever, and the black smoke that had poured from the painting coalesced into the shape of Ilara's spirit, writhing and screaming in agony. "No!" Ilara's voice echoed through the studio, filled with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You cannot banish me. I am eternal." Her form flickered wildly, her face contorting between the twisted visage of the woman from the painting and the ethereal beauty of her true self. Aiden felt a surge of fear, but also determination. He couldn't let her win. Dr. Graves' voice rose above the chaos, his incantation reaching its final, decisive words. The air seemed to vibrate with power, and the symbols in the circle began to spin, their light forming a swirling vortex around Ilara's spirit. "Aiden, hold her!" the historian shouted, his voice strained but steady. Aiden hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his hands outstretched. Ilara's spirit shrieked as he grasped her, her form cold and unyielding, like holding onto a shadow made solid. He felt a searing pain in his palms, as if her very essence was burning him, but he didn't let go. "Lila, fight her!" Aiden cried, his voice breaking with desperation. "You're stronger than this." The spirit's form flickered again, and for a brief moment he saw Lila's face, her real face, filled with fear and determination. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The vortex of light intensified, pulling Ilara's spirit toward the painting with irresistible force. The spirit screamed, its voice filled with rage and desperation as it struggled against the pull. "You cannot defeat me," it roared, its form flickering wildly. "Yes, we can," Aiden said through gritted teeth, his hands trembling but firm. He tightened his grip, ignoring the searing pain in his palms. The light grew brighter, the vortex spinning faster, and Ilara's spirit began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into wisps of smoke. With a final ear-splitting scream, Ilara's spirit was pulled into the painting, the vortex of light collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. The studio fell silent, the only sound the faint patter of rain against the windows. Aiden stumbled back, his hands raw and trembling, and collapsed to the floor. Dr. Graves let out a long, shaky breath, his face pale but relieved. "It's done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knelt beside Aiden, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did it. She's gone." Aiden's heart raced as he looked around the room. The painting lay on the floor, its surface cracked and blackened, as if it had been burned from within. The symbols in the circle had faded, their light extinguished. And then he saw her Lila, lying unconscious beside the circle. He scrambled to her side, his hands trembling as he brushed the hair from her face. "Lila," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her eyelids fluttered, and she took a shallow breath. "Aiden," she murmured, her voice weak but unmistakably hers. Relief flooded through him, so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Dr. Graves stood, a faint smile on his face. "She'll be weak for a while," he said, "but she'll recover. You both will." Aiden nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. He helped Lila sit up, holding her close as the storm outside began to subside. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Aiden allowed himself to breathe.